84% of Germans answered yes. There were twice as many against votes as in the first plebiscite, about 10%, but this could hardly be regarded as an increase in the number of Hitler's opponents. It's just that parliamentary traditions were still strong in Germany, and combining posts did not seem reasonable to everyone. These hesitations affected the result, but these same hesitations again proved that unanimity was not ensured by a baton. And what? We already know, dear reader, that since 1933 the new government has energetically taken on the economy. For the first time in the history of Germany after the First World War, she respectfully addressed the people not only in plebiscites but also in speeches by senior government leaders, but did their conversations and disputes with ordinary people, and moreover, think differently than the authorities mean little. However, that was not all. Already in 1933, for example, youth holiday camps appeared for members of the Hitler Youth Organization, Hitler's Youth, traveling around the country. By 1934, 5 million boys had been in permanent and tent camps, almost all German teenagers. For the first time, the education of a new generation, as discussed in Mein Kampf, became the most important state matter. From 10 to 14 years old, this was done by Deutsches Jungwop for boys and Jungmädchen for girls. From 14 to 18 years old, Hitler Youth and the Union of German Girls. Even more unusual for the German worker was the state's organization of his leisure time. And before that, many Germans led a very active lifestyle. In 1928, approximately 5 million people were members of sports and gymnastics societies, almost every 12 Germans. However, this was then a private matter for everyone. The official authorities were indifferent to this side of German life. But in the very first Nazi year, in November 1933, the famous Kraft der Freude, Strength Through Joy, was created. She immediately received large government subsidies, and what she did is clear from the names of her 7 imperial departments: vacations, travel and tourism, aesthetics and dignity of work, physical culture and sports, training and education, cultures, folk customs and traditions. For youth affairs, Kraft der Freude (KDF) supervised the work of the German labor houses, organized trips to museums, theaters and concerts. KDF also had its own amateur theaters, numerous holiday homes and boarding houses on the coast of the Baltic and North Seas on the island of R. General. First-class cruise ships were built for its needs. In 1934, 2 million workers took part in trips organized by the KDF. In 1935, 3, and in 1936, already 6 million. The average worker's earnings were 140 Reichsmarks, and a 6-month trip to Lake Geneva with travel, food and service cost 66 marks, to the North Sea, 35 marks, a cruise around Italy, 155 marks, a ticket to a theater or a symphony concert for a worker, not for an aristocrat, cost 70 Pfennig in the KDF for any seat, and classes in amateur performances, sports clubs, participation in dance and entertainment evenings were free. And how should a German worker feel if, when she got married and left her job, she received a government loan of 1,000 marks solely for the purchase of furniture and household items? Therefore, it is not surprising that when in the spring of 1936 Hitler and Joachim von Ribbentrop's wife Anneliese walked up the Rhine to Biberich, people quit their jobs, vinagrowers waved their hands, factory whistles sounded, and thousands of people greeted them on the piers. Hitler then said, "My greatest pride is that I have won the heart of the German worker." Social, and indeed all of Hitler's reforms and actions were, of course, very inconsistent and sometimes contradictory. So the Krupps and Borsigs still lived in palaces, and their workers had more than modest and cramped apartments. Control over the economy was not so strong as to exclude the influence of American capital on it. For example, the general director of the Junkers factory is already familiar to us. Kauenberg enlightened our friend Manfred von Brauchitsch. In the 20s, large American capital flowed to us, greatly strengthening the industry. I received $1 million loan for my business from a private American bank. Huge sums were received by Vereinigte Gelsenkirchener Werk AG. Tyson H. Kauenberg fell silent, then waved his hand. And what can we say about Krupp and Hugo Stins? Brachich admitted, listened to him with growing amazement. It was not without difficulty that I digested Kauenberg's dry information about the intertwining of international financial interests. Influential business circles of different countries were inextricably linked with each other, and this connection objectively undermined the independence of Germany and at the same time limited Hitler's freedom of political maneuver. The moral situation in German society was also inconsistent. Appeals to the best sides of human nature, collectivism, healthy feelings, the cult of a healthy body were combined with declarations of racial exclusivity, and this inevitably produced and developed national complacency and arrogance. But Nazi social policy had one obvious strength: it was reality, and this completely excluded prospects for Thielmann's party. In addition, the Germans in the general political, economic and spiritual line of Nazism were clearly attracted by the dynamism and direct appeal to the creative forces of the nation. The people are capable of much in any country if they are approached directly and without fools, or at least with subtle calculation, but supported by real positive measures. The greatest success here was achieved, of course, by the Russian Bolsheviks of the Lenin-Stalin model. This party standard, in contrast to the Trotskyist standard as a matter of course, implied the ability not to theorize and make passionate speeches about the revolution. However, one had to be able to do this, but the ability to do a specific job and lead a specific business. Attacking a cavalry regiment, organizing new construction or a new collective farm, working at an aircraft factory and researching the Arctic. Lenin used to say that the Bolsheviks convinced Russia, they conquered Russia, and now they need to learn to rule Russia. He said this openly, and it was honesty before the masses that was the secret of the success of the Lenin-Stalin core of the KSB. The example of the KSB was the most convincing and most striking, but it was not isolated. Franklin Delano Roosevelt became President of America during difficult times of crisis for capital. America was on the verge, if not of a proletarian revolution, then of some very fundamental social upheavals. It is enough to give only 3 details. In the summer of 1932, the governor of Mississippi T. Bilbo admitted, "I myself became pink," and Minnesota Governor F. Olson told the government emissary, "Tell them there in the capital that Olson is no longer taking anyone into the National Guard who is not a Red." Minnesota is a left-leaning state. Multi-millionaire George Kennedy, JFK's father, later reported that in those days he was willing to part with half his fortune in order to hold on to the other half under law and order. With the help of Roosevelt, however, it was possible to retain the first half, although U.S. capital had to unfasten amounts from it for social needs in previously unprecedented amounts. But how did Roosevelt act? Investments in extensive public works, food packages, this goes without saying. But it was Roosevelt who first sat in front of a microphone. TV cameras then appeared only in research laboratories and began live broadcasting his famous Saturday fireside conversations with the people of America. He said something like this: "Well, friends, so another week has passed. What did we manage to do and what did we fail?" Tens of millions of Americans listened to him with bated breath, because even if he did not tell them the whole truth, he nevertheless said much of what, if the highest authority of the country had not said it, then the Kennedy clan might indeed have lost not only the first, but also the second half of the state. Hitler also directly addressed the masses, and not at the fireplace, but in open stadiums in front of hundreds of thousands, and even, as we know, in front of 1 million of his fellow citizens. The contrast with the very recent times was obvious for the Germans. Here is what Manfred von Brachich wrote about these pre-Nazi times. On July 13, 1931, the economic crisis with all its devastating consequences burst into Germany. Thousands of investors rushed to save their savings. Bank doors closed, some of them forever. Cinemas, cafes, theaters and entertainment venues were deserted. It seemed that everyone was left without money. The worries about their daily bread have fallen like a heavy burden on people. This was just 4 years before 2 million German workers set off on cruises around Europe. However, even at the height of the crisis in the same summer of 1931, not everyone grieved. This was also testified by Manfred von Brauchitsch. Those who managed to profit from this gigantic bankruptcy dispersed to fashionable resorts. There, the rich had fun with all their might. They attended winter sports competitions, flirted with the ladies and turned night into day. Is it necessary to comment on this eyewitness testimony, my dear reader? Another year passed. Berlin was teeming with young men from Nazi combat units marching to the sounds of countless Hitler orchestras. Von Brauchitsch wrote about May 1932, but he himself stated, "The grey and faceless regime of the Weimar Republic was drowning before our eyes." Nevertheless, dear reader, shouldn't we return to this Weimar Germany of the early 20s and once again take a look at the path of it and its future further to the Third Reich? So, in the fall of 1919, Hitler was in obscurity and his personal problems were exclusively his personal problems. However, already in the winter of 1920 he flies to Berlin and there meets the hero of the First World War, Infantry General Ludendorff. In the summer and autumn he actively performs publicly, meets Rosenberg and the brothers Otto and Gregor Strasser. The NSDAP already has 3,000 members. In the winter of 1921, he performed at the Munich Circus in front of 6,000 people and at the same time met with the Prime Minister of Bavaria, Ritter von Kahr. On July 11, 1921, Hitler issues an ultimatum demanding that he be appointed head of the party with emergency powers and a threat to otherwise leave the party. As a result, he becomes the head of the NSDAP, but in its leadership there was, for example, such a decisive and strong-willed person as Captain Rem. This is someone you can't deny, a bullish appearance and bullish pressure with obvious courage and the ability to subjugate people. But the leader of the party is Hitler. And at the same time the first SAW assault troops were created. Moreover, they are created by Rem. But for Hitler, in April 1922, Walter Rathenau signed the Treaty of Rapallo with the RSFSR. However, for this reason we will not consider him a sincere friend of Russia. The German Jew Rathenau, a major industrialist and the son of a major industrialist, also dabbled in the ideas of creating some kind of international super consortium for the enslavement and exploitation of Russia. However, he did better than he thought. Reichswehr von Sieg begins to cooperate with the Red Army. And on June 4, 1922, Rathenau was killed by a bullet from a member of the right-wing organization Council, not for Rapallo, but for the conciliatory Brussels policy. And on the same day, a coincidence, of course, Hitler briefly goes to prison for the first time. On August 16, he is already the main character of the mass demonstration on the square in Munich. Two brass bands are playing. Hitler at the head of 6 columns of NSDAP members marching with swastika armbands. Mussolini's black shirts at this time captured Ravenna and other Italian cities, and they were preparing for the famous march on Rome. Hitler's representative Eldek met with the Deuce in Milan, and on October 28 Mussolini entered Rome, and Hitler begins to be called the Mussolini of Germany. In 1922, Hitler's entourage included new nationalists, World War I ace Hermann Göring and Rudolf Hess. Hess began the war as an infantry officer in the same regiment where Hitler served and ended it, like Göring, in the air. Göring had good officer connections. Hess was friends with the geopolitician General Haushofer, even though the latter was married to a Jewish woman. Americans also seem to be interested in Hitler. This moment, dear reader, is both subtle and dark. In any case, one of the Anglo-Saxon biographers of Hitler, Toland, describing Hitler's acquaintance with Patsy Hanfstaengl, completely ignores the Henfe line and falsely reports that Patsy graduated from Bavarian and not Harvard, as in fact, university. For those who know how to observe and draw conclusions, Hitler is already a figure who deserves at least attention. And the appearance of Patsy next to him is a sign of this attention, not only on a Bavarian scale. But by 1922, Hitler became a real force, still only in Bavaria. And here his position is strong. Thousands of new members are joining his party. 3/4 of the Munich secret police are his supporters. As for the city police, then almost all Munich police were like that. On January 11, 1923, French and Belgian troops entered the Ruhr. The mark fell almost 10 times in half a month. On January 27, the founding day of the NSDAP, Hitler plans a series of rallies. Parade of 6,000 stormtroopers, banners with swastikas. With the $1,000 borrowed from Putzi, Hitler bought 2 printing presses and turned the Volkischer Beobachter from a weekly into a daily newspaper. He often goes with Putzi Hanfstaengl and driver Emil Moritz on propaganda trips. During leisure hours he plays with Putzi and Helen Hanfstaengl's 2-year-old son Egan and more. And also, as Moritz writes, we ran around with women together. On September 2, 1923, 100,000 nationalists gathered in Nuremberg to celebrate German Day, the anniversary of the victory at Sedan. And on the same day the German Battle League was organized there. A month later, Hitler was declared the political leader of the new organization. Inflation has become a collapse. On the 1,000 mark banknote, the billion marks stamp was simply stamped in paint, and this billion was worth $40. For the elite, this was a trick that made it possible to pay reparations with a devalued mark, at least for a while. For the people this meant collapse. Anyone who had saved money throughout his entire life for a house could now only buy a couple of bottles of schnapps with this amount to drown the bitterness of loss. But the one who already had this house, and even more so, who had the steel trust, retained ownership of it. This meant that industrial magnates did not actually go bankrupt, but only temporarily curtailed their business activities. The situation was heating up. From January to mid-October 1923, 35,000 new members joined the NSDAP. In Munich alone there were 4,000 of them against 2,600 policemen and garrison soldiers. The idea of an armed uprising and seizure of power in Bavaria seemed successful and feasible. From all this the beer hall putsch was born. But there are so many strange things in his story that one can assume. Both the events and the background of the events were by no means exactly the same as they are usually described. Of course, Hitler could have been let down by a lack of experience. It's one thing to organize a rally and another thing to organize a coup. Outwardly, everything happened like this. On the 8th of November 1923, the de facto governing triumvirate of Bavaria, von Kahr, von Lossow and von Seisser, held a mass meeting in the largest beer hall in Munich, the Biergerber Keller, which could accommodate 3,000 people. Its meaning was that this leading trio was not averse to overthrowing the central Weimar government, and the meeting was to become one of the stages on the path to a future coup. Hitler expected to speak on November 11 with essentially the same goal, but as his biographers report, he decided to take advantage of the opportunity and begin his campaign against Berlin with the putsch in Munich. In the beer hall on November 8, all sorts of people gathered, but for some reason there was no Nazi predominance, otherwise the Nazis would not have had to threaten the assembled crowd with a machine gun at some point. At 8 in the evening, Hitler drove up to the pub in a red Mercedes with a small group of attack aircraft. There were 125 policemen, not counting the mounted detachment and the agents in the crowd. From the barracks located 500 meters from the Biergerber Keller, reinforcements could be easily called for if necessary. Upon entering the hall, the stormtroopers quickly took control of the situation. Hitler, pistol in hand, jumped onto a chair, fired into the air and shouted, "The National Revolution has begun. The hall is surrounded." After that, he invited the triumvirs to go into the room behind the stage, but they refused. Hitler climbed onto the stage, and his path was blocked by the adjutant of the chief of the Bavarian police. According to the descriptions, Hitler allegedly hit him on the head and he realized that resistance is pointless. All this sounds strange, because Hitler did not look like Schwarzenegger, and police chiefs at all times did not select their adjutants from among the frail, unemployed assistants of university professors. None of the main participants in this scene, that is all three ones and Hitler himself, subsequently denied that von Kahr was offered the post of regent of Bavaria, von Lossow, the minister of war of the entire Reich, and von Seisser, the minister of the interior. But all this after Hitler and Ludendorff, following the example of the Deuce, march on Berlin and take national power there. How the three fronts actually responded is unknown, but Hitler came out to the public and declared that the triumvirate was with him, and Ludendorff has already appeared in Birger Barakel. It seemed like the deal was in the bag. There are 4,000 stormtroopers, 2,600 police officers, and among those the majority are nationalists. In another beer hall, Rem gathered 2,000 people from the SA. At 9 o'clock the column moved towards von Losso's headquarters and occupied it without resistance. There were plenty of weapons before, and even more so now. Meanwhile, cadets from the infantry school approached the Birger Barakel and supported the putsch. But Ludendorff, who remained to guard the three once first released von Losso on parole on business, and then Carr and Zeisser also slipped away. After this, something strange began. The commander of the Munich garrison Losso contacts the Reichswehr commander von Siecht. Still, an interesting thing is history. In May 1991, historian Vasily Sabanin wrote that the NSDAP and its Führer are in some way the brainchild of Siecht. This may be so, although it is unlikely to be so, but at his birth this child was for Siecht something like an enfant terrible child. Otherwise, he would not have given the order to von Losso to decisively suppress the putsch. Actually, Siecht had, as they say, a big grudge against the Nazis at that time. In September 1923, the Volkischer Beobachter defeated the general married to a Jewish woman, calling him an enemy of the populist idea, a lackey of the Weimar Republic and a pawn of sinister Jewish Masonic elements, and the putsch was crushed. The police suddenly began shooting at a convoy marching through the streets of Munich on the morning of November 9, led by Hitler, Göring, and Ludendorff. It all ended quickly and somehow strange. In later descriptions, the beer hall putsch looks like an impromptu, like a pure improvisation of Hitler. But for some reason, too many these days either ended up in exactly the right place on time or, on the contrary, did not end up there even when they simply had to be there. It seems to me that everything can be explained by the fact that at approximately the same time two different coups were planned, fueled by, although related, but different forces and with different goals. Hitler viewed the Munich speech as the beginning of his quest for national power, and the three backgrounds hoped to proclaim the autonomy of Bavaria during their putsch. And Hitler's beer hall putsch failed not because it was his gamble, but because during the putsch the elite simply betrayed Hitler, realizing that if the latter was successful, they would have to fade into the background and play secondary roles in such a united Germany, where Hitler will be the national leader. Hitler, Göring, Rem were just starting out as politicians, and Carr and his colleagues, if they didn't eat the dog in it, then drank a lot of Bavarian beer during the political battles. And then they outplayed the Nazis. Hitler was imprisoned in the town of Landberg. Any prison is not a resort, but the living conditions there were created tolerable for Hitler. He read a lot, thought, and came, among other things, to the conclusion that a violent seizure of power was not the way for the German Nazis. Power must be achieved legally through parliamentary struggle. This conclusion determined the entire tactics and strategy of the NSDAP for the next almost 10 years until their legal victory in the elections to the Reichstag. In February-March 1924, a trial took place, and Hitler received 5 years with credit for pre-trial detention. The prisoner of cell No. 7 returned to it again for his sentence. The first part of Mein Kampf was written there, and on December 19, 1924, the Supreme Court of Bavaria decides on Hitler's early release, and the new year 1925 soon arrived and became for him a year of intense organizational work. Moreover, a conflict was already brewing with Gregor Strasser and his younger brother Otto. Strasser's secretary was then Goebbels, who replaced Himmler in this post. Goebbels then relied on Strasser, who relied on the workers, while Hitler counted on the support of the middle class and the elite, and, naturally, without neglecting the workers. On November 4, 1925, Hitler and Goebbels met for the first time and soon found a common language. And in February 1926, Hitler eliminated the emerging split in the party. And he eliminated it very simply. He convened regional party leaders, Gauleiters, and, without going into long discussions about where the Nazis should go, left or right, he declared that the only possible path for himself was the one along which the NSDAP was walking with him, Hitler. Or he is the leader, the Führer, and everyone swears allegiance to him, or he is not the Führer. The Gauleiters understood who the party's popularity rested on, and so they chose the path of the Führer. On February 28, he performed at the National Club 1919 in Hamburg. After his release from Landsberg, he was prohibited from speaking at official rallies, but it was a private club. He addressed respectable people, and his speech was restrained, which immediately dispelled the myth about him as a frantic, impulsive speaker. By the summer of 1926, complete control over the party was achieved, and by the end of that year, the NSDAP consisted of 50,000 people. The secretariat included Hess, secretary, Schwartz, treasurer, Bohler, imperial party clerk. The staff of the apparatus numbered several dozen people. There were departments of foreign policy, labor, industry, agriculture, economics, internal affairs, justice, nation and press. Under the NSDAP, the Hitler Youth Leagues of women, teachers, lawyers and doctors were created. The official uniform of the party was black riding breeches, brown shirts and black ties. History sometimes plays significant jokes. Over time, the epithet Browns will become synonymous with Nazis and turn into a noun. But why were brown shirts chosen? Mussolini chose black shirts for the Italian fascists, of course, deliberately. It was a symbol. But stormtroopers received brown shirts at the end of 1926, as they say, by chance. At cheap wholesale prices, the poor NSDAP managed to purchase a large batch of such shirts, which, in the days when Germany still had colonies, were intended for German troops in East Africa. The irony of fate and history is that the anti-Versailles party of Hitler owed its branded party color to the Treaty of Versailles, which deprived the Reich of its colonies. In 1926, the second volume of Mein Kampf was published with a chapter on Russia. You and I, dear reader, already know what was said there. And in August 1927, at a meeting in the presence of 20,000 Nazis, Hitler named three monsters that were depriving Germany of its strength: internationalism, democracy and pacifism. The assessment, it must be said, was not without merit. On May 20, 1928, in the elections to the Reichstag, the NSDAP received 12 parliamentary seats, including a seat for Goebbels. Goebbels then said, "There are no contradictions between socialism and National Socialism. They complement each other. If they are turned against each other, they are destructive. Together they are revolutionary and progressive." Well, there was something to think about. By the end of 1928, the NSDAP already had 100,000 members. Hitler often speaks in the capital. And Albert Speer, then an assistant to Professor Tessenov at the Higher Technical School in Berlin-Charlottenburg, recalled one of these speeches. In a decent suit, he looked quite respectable. Everything about him was modest. To me, there was something endearing about all this that contradicted what his opponents were trying to portray: a hysterical demagogue, a screaming, gesticulating fanatic in uniform. 1929 brings the NSDAP a block with the National People's Party of film and press magnate Alfred Hugenberg. We'll get to know him better. And with the Steel Helmet, an organization of war veterans. In the 1932 presidential election, Steel Helmet member Theodor Duesterberg received 2.5 million votes but withdrew his candidacy in favor of Hitler. The year 1929 was also marked by the struggle against the Young Plan, and we need to say more about it, going back 6 years. Then, on November 30, 1923, Hitler was just under arrest after the failure of the putsch, under the leadership of 60-year-old American General Charles Gates Dawes. He is also the Vice President of the United States and the founding director of the largest Chicago bank, Central Trust of Illinois, associated with the Morgan Group, and the English financier M.C. Kenny began work on a commission to determine the solvency of Germany. On January 1, 1924, the new German Commissioner for National Currency, Hjalmar Schacht, the future president of the Reichsbank, and the governor of the Bank of England, Montague Norman, met in London to discuss the terms of a loan designed to revive the German economy. And in August 1924, the DOS plan was announced at the London Conference. On August 30, 1924, a law on monetary reform was passed in Germany, and from that day the plan came into force. Its essence was that in the next 5 years Germany would pay reparations of 1.5 billion marks in gold, then 2.5. Under the right to control German railways and banks, the United States allocated the first loan of 200 million to the Germans. Other loans followed. In June 1929, at the next Paris conference, instead of the DOS plan, the plan of the 55-year-old American financier O.N.D. Young, he is also the head of General Electric, not counting posts at the Federal Reserve Bank and General Motors Morgan, was adopted. According to Young's plan, by 1988 Germany had to pay reparations worth 112 golden billions. Before 1966, 2 billion per year. After 1966, 1.6-1.7 billion. It was such cheerful long-term prospects that Hitler spoke out against. However, Young's plan, through loans, stimulated business activity for the time being, and at the end of 1929, in a plebiscite in relation to this plan, Hitler, along with Hugenberg, received only 6 million votes, while at least 21 million were required for the failure of the plebiscite. Hitler broke with Hugenberg, and Chancellor Stresemann won with his liberal policies. He, however, died suddenly before the final count of votes. The economy seemed to be growing, the tension in minds and souls was easing, and the then British ambassador in Berlin, Lord D'Abernon, believed that Hitler was gradually fading into political oblivion. However, just in 1929, the NSDAP bought a 3-story house for itself in Munich, and in September Hitler moved to a new 9-room apartment in an expensive area of Munich. Industrialists then, although not en masse, already supported the Nazis, and the 70-year-old director of the powerful Ruhr-Westphalian coal syndicate Emil Kerdorf himself joined the NSDAP in 1927. A year later he left it for tactical purposes but did not stop helping the party with funds. It wasn't easy with the NSDAP and the Germans. While the party leaders of the NSDAP were blocking with the industrial leaders, ordinary Nazis sometimes fought off the police shoulder to shoulder with the communists. The prosperity turned out to be short-lived. The crisis came to the world of capitalism. In different countries, its peak occurred in different years. Manfred von Brauchitsch remembered the year 1931, but by the summer of 1930 there were 3 million unemployed in Germany. Not very much, but not very little either. Bjarning was the chancellor. A colorless and gloomy figure, he was closely connected with the Vatican, passed decrees to reduce wages and increase taxes. The people were dissatisfied. Hitler denounced the financial tycoons, and the electoral activity of the Germans increased. If in 1928 31 million people came to the Reichstag elections, then in 1930 already 35 million. While waiting for the result of the vote count, Hitler said, if it were 100, but the NSDAP received 107 seats in the Reichstag, gaining 6,371,000 votes and becoming the second party in Germany after the Social Democrats. Of course, it was a success, albeit an intermediate one. However, it was already almost clear that Hitler was entering the finish line with a good chance of becoming first. What is interesting is that opposition historian Gerhard Ritter from the University of Freiburg believed that Nazism had no roots in German history, but came from the French Revolution. But the Frenchman Édouard Herriot regarded as profound the analysis of the French ambassador to Germany Franz Uponset, who derived Nazism from Protestant pietism against the Catholic center and more generally against spiritual anarchy in the country. So, there were French who clearly nodded to the deeply German basis of Nazism, but there were also Germans who saw French roots in it. The answer to these 2 points of view was given by the German people themselves, who brought the Nazis to power legally, within the framework of the democratic procedure of parliamentary elections. And this was not some kind of choice of the heart, but the result of 10 years of work by both the NSDAP and Hitler, and the thoughts of the ordinary German about whether the Nazis and Hitler could become the destiny of Germany and bring it stability and prosperity. Therefore, the success of Hitler and Nazism was determined objectively, and this was the fact from which the German policy of the Soviet Union had to proceed in the first place. However, by the time Hitler became Chancellor of the Reich, Litvinov, People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs of the USSR, was already well prepared for a battle with him and with his any attempts to establish normal relations with the USSR, despite ideological differences. Chapter 9. Admixtures of alcohol, admixtures of strife and People's Commissar Mir Litvinov. In September 1930, Stalin wrote to Molotov, "It would be better to appoint Kinchuk to Berlin. He is a business manager and he will be more useful there than Surets, who is in the household. I'm not experienced in matters." These lines have a backstory. On September 10, the Politburo approved Yakov Surets, then the plenipotentiary representative in Turkey, as plenipotentiary representative in Germany. But Lev Kinchuk really worked actively in the economic bodies of Soviet power since Lenin's times. Despite his Menshevik past and the fact that he joined the party only in 1920, he was appreciated. Therefore, Stalin's point of view won then. On September 15, the Politburo changed its decision and Kinchuk went to Berlin. A long-time ally of the People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs of the USSR, Maxim Litvinov, Surets remained in Turkey for now. The essence of our then relations with Germany was determined by 3 phrases from the Memorandum of Plenipotentiary Kinchuk to Reich Chancellor von Schleicher dated December 21, 1932. About 1/3 of all products of the German engineering industry is exported to the USSR, the other third is exported to other countries, and approximately 1/3 remains on the domestic market. While Germany's exports to the USSR play such a significant role in its entire economy, the USSR's balance of payments towards Germany is becoming more and more passive to the detriment of the USSR. In 1932, the deficit was approximately 300 million German marks, which means that in the current year the USSR imported gold and currency into Germany for the said amount. In 1932, we exported from Germany almost all the steam and gas turbines produced there, almost all the presses, cranes and locomotives, 70% of the machine tools, 60% of the excavators, dynamos and metal trusses, half of the nickel, high-quality iron, blowers and fans. In general, it turned out that neither we without Germany, nor she without us, could develop a peaceful economy normally. Yes, there were enough frictions and misunderstandings, but with such extensive market connections it was difficult to expect anything else. The Germans wanted us to pay our dollar obligations in greenbacks or gold. We insisted on stamps or barter. Kinchuk sarcastically pointed out to von Below, State Secretary of the Außenamt, German Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that Germany resells almost all the furs purchased from us for dollars. And then he reproached for the red tape with the reduction of duties on caviar, while the season for selling caviar has already arrived. Bickering with von Below became something of a mutual sport. Nevertheless, familiarity with the documentary records of these disputes leads to a single thought. Oh, if the claims of states to each other were only like this, then there would be nothing else left to wish for. Kinchuk was extremely worried about the increase in the alcohol admixture in gasoline from 6% to 10%. It's really unpleasant. This, however, did not threaten a war, even a customs war. However, other unpleasant impurities of a political nature increasingly appeared in mutual relations, and often these admixtures smelled of Trotskyism of the worst Comintern brand. On March 5, 1932, a bell rang in the Moscow office of the German ambassador Dirksen. The news turned out to be not very cheerful. An attempt was made on the life of embassy advisor von Twardowski, and he was hospitalized with a serious injury. The bullet shattered 2 bones of the left hand. Dirksen immediately went to the hospital. Twardowski had already undergone surgery, and the advisor, although pale from shock, behaved with restraint and tried to smile. By the way, he fully recovered from his wounds only after several years and after several operations. The terrorist intended to kill Dirksen himself, and Twardowski became the victim of a mistake. Dirksen was informed about this by Deputy People's Commissar Krestinsky and the head of the German Department of the People's Commissariat of Foreign Affairs, Stern, who rushed to the ambassador to apologize. 5 bullets were fired through the rear window of the car at Twardowski. On the 6th shot, the revolver misfired. A student named Stern shot at the German. Stern, as you know, is translated from German and from Yiddish. Yiddish in fact means Jewish German as star. And as we see, reader, a lot of dubious stars shone on the then Moscow political sky, and almost all of them shone with a Trotskyist shine. Look for who benefits. This is a fail-safe rule. The murder of the German ambassador was beneficial only to the Trotskyists because the calculation here was, firstly, to break with Germany, and secondly, as a consequence, to completely disrupt the 5-year plans. And its failure is the collapse of Stalin. Trotsky and his supporters were no longer interested in anything else. I did not really like the developed Soviet-German ties and parts of the German elite. Von Schleicher's predecessor, Reich Chancellor von Papen, in his interview with the French Matin and Petit Parisien in the summer of 1932, openly called for a Franco-German rapprochement and even insisted on a military alliance. In the summer of 1932, in East Prussian Königsberg, a police incident occurred at the Soviet Consulate General. Germany still had a Weimar, not a Nazi, government, but incidents were occurring more frequently. And their reason was not so much the Papen's anti-communism as the fact that Soviet organizations in Germany often confuse diplomatic and economic work with political work. And this time the reason for the conflict was given by us. Nevertheless, on August 17, Kinchuk met with von Bülow in a fighting mood, fueled by Litvinov's instructions. Mr. Secretary of State, I am extremely upset, but today we will have to talk not about caviar, furs and turbines, but, I guess von Bülow interrupted Kinchuk. You are talking about this sad Königsberg incident. Not only, I would like, Mr. Kinchuk, if you don't mind, to get this over with first. Well, but I'll remind you right away. A police officer did not have the right to burst into the office premises of our consulate and demand a search. I checked everything through my secretary Gershfeld. Your policeman actually arrested our consul's Metternich, his wife and our representative at the Königsberg Fair, Gordon. The consulate is extraterritorial, Mr. Bülow, isn't it? Of course. Criminal assistant Tortler did not and could not have such powers. He was supposed to conduct a search at the apartment of the communist functionary Frisch, who lived in the same building. Frisch answered the doorbell, and when Tortler announced to him the purpose of the visit, Frisch led him into the room, which later turned out to be the consul's premises. Tortler could not assume that Frisch's premises were also the premises of the consulate. This explanation does not satisfy me. Moreover, I am authorized to draw your attention to the unacceptable print campaign on this issue in Angriff. But Angriff is a Nazi-printed organ, not an Ausumte, Mr. Kinchuk. And von Papen, excuse me, the Reich Chancellor of Germany. Bülow became embarrassed and after an awkward pause asked guiltily, are you talking about his interview with the French? Yes, Mr. Kinchuk. Von Papen is not inclined to abandon the Rapallo line. There can be no talk of a change in attitude towards the USSR, but in the interview there are undoubted anti-Soviet attacks. Bülow fell silent again, this time calmly thinking about something, and then quietly but decisively said, Mr. Ambassador, Papen is not a diplomat of the old school, and this was especially evident in his interview. He also differs from his predecessors, both Bjarning and Stresemann. Bülow paused and then finished. He throws out words before thinking carefully about whether he should have thrown them out, and this spoils a lot for him. Only to him. Well, of course, and Germany. Let us note, reader, that both this time and earlier and later, the Germans did not poke our plenipotentiary representative in the eyes with Twardowski's unhealing hand. Integrity in trifles, and at that turbulent time even the Moscow super incident was still a trifle, is the integrity of petty people. Alas, the People's Commissariat of Foreign Affairs of the USSR, modeled after Litvinov, was increasingly slipping into just such a principled position. Such skirmishes harmed both Germany and the USSR. Meanwhile, difficult and controversial times were coming in Germany, and the position of the Soviet Union in the face of the Germans became increasingly ambiguous. As a socialist country, the USSR supported Thielmann and the Communists. The majority of Germans did not want Thielmann. Let me remind you that there were 3 and even 4 main political forces in Germany at that time: Hugenberg nationalists, Social Democrats, Communists and Hitler. Neither of these forces had a decisive advantage at the very beginning of the 1930s, but if the German voter had been faced with a stark choice, only Thielmann or only, say, Hitler would have won. True, the mechanical counting of the total votes usually cast for Social Democrats and Communists seemed to ensure victory for the left bloc. However, this was only elementary school arithmetic. It was not the split in the leaders but the split in the mood of the masses, the split in the country that prevented the creation of a workable Reichstag based on a coalition majority of Social Democrats and Communists. Only presidential elections could give real political power. In 1932, almost 14 million people voted for Hitler as a possible president. Thielmann and the leftists did not have such numbers even close. Old Hindenburg won. He won because Germany was more right than left, and inclined towards nationalism rather than internationalism. At the same time, Germany had an abundance of unemployed and other people dispossessed by capitalism. The balance of political forces reflected the state of minds and souls. The German did not want extremes, he gravitated toward the middle, but he was ready to swing not to the left of it, but to the right. Therefore, in the parliamentary dilemma, Nazis or Communists, a considerable number of those who voted for the Social Democrats would not risk voting for the Communist Party. And even if we imagine purely speculatively that the Communists would unite with the Social Democrats, then some of the Communist voters would not forgive Thielmann for such a compromise, and some of the Social Democratic voters would be afraid of the excessive leftward movement of the country. No, a left bloc capable of stabilizing society did not take place in Germany. For USSR diplomacy, there was something to think about here. Ideological positions required orientation in Germany towards Thielmann, and economic and state interests towards so who. Thielmann could not give either turbines or most favored nation treatment, and Hitler was clearly coming to power. And even before his arrival it was clear, if the USSR did not break with ideology in its relations with Germany, then Germany would begin to break with the USSR. But it provided the USSR with almost 2/3 of our imports of industrial products. In 1932, from France we exported cars worth less than 3 million gold rubles, from the USA, 29, from England, 67. And from Germany, 251 million. The total imports of the USSR from democratic countries looked like this for 3 years, from 1930 to 1932. From England, 80 million rubles, 73 million, 91 million. Then the volume of imports from England fell again. From France, 29 million, 15 million, 4 million. From the USA, 264 million, 229 million, 32 million, and further, no more than this low level. What was it like with the totalitarian countries? From Italy we exported 11 million in 1930, then 30 million, and a year later, 27 million. Later this figure increased. Germany sold us its products worth 250 million, 411 million and 324 million rubles, almost twice as much as the richest industrial leader in the world, the United States, and only Germany was ready to maintain this high level of trade exchange in the future as high, and even taller. Under these conditions, was it worth warming up the communist functionaries of the Reichs in their consulates, or inflate minor incidents and newspaper provocations to the level of major diplomatic troubles? The press of all capitalist countries, including officialdom, was full of anti-Sovietism. Neither England nor France, much less the United States, hid anti-communism. And this did not stop us from pursuing, for example, the establishment of official diplomatic relations with the states, and only to the German press of the Kid Maxim Litvinov reacted immediately, and always extremely and strangely painful. Why did it happen this way? After all, Germany and only Germany was vitally necessary for the only thing important for Russia, the economic strengthening of the Socialist Soviet Union. Who, one wonders, led to our quarrel, and for what? In the summer, Kinchak reprimanded Below for Papin's anti-Soviet interview with the French Petit Parisien, and on November 30, Litvinov calmly gave an interview to the correspondent of this newspaper, Luchany. You read it and are amazed. The People's Commissar of the Workers' and Peasants' Government, the old Bolshevik underground worker Papa, an agent of Lenin's Iskra, publicly declared, the people and groups most hostile to us in France cannot with any reason claim that they are political, emphasis added, SK, or the economic interests of France and the USSR collide at any point on the globe. These individuals and groups usually call for hostile actions against the USSR in the name of the abstract, emphasis added, SK, idea of defending the capitalist system. I draw your attention, dear reader, to this subtle point in these exaggerated circumstances. As a statesman, Litvinov spoke quite the right words in an interview. That is, he said what he had to say if he sought to strengthen the state positions and power of the USSR. But what did Litvinov, the Bolshevik revolutionary, look like? After all, the political interests of bourgeois, capitalist France and proletarian Soviet Russia anywhere in the world were directly opposed. France sought to preserve capitalism, the USSR to its historical collapse, and the fight against the USSR was not an abstract idea for the French elite, but a way of real defense of their privileges which constitute the essence of capitalism. However, it turns out that Litvinov could speak to the French without revolutionary ardor. This line, I repeat, was correct from the standpoint of ensuring state interests, but for some reason, in relations with the Germans, the statesman was, as a rule, tempted to RR revolutionary PRR principality. Why? After all, the realities of the world were such that the idea of a world fire really became more and more abstract for the USSR. It increasingly began to directly threaten the interests of the first state of socialism. The best way to spread socialism around the world was to create in the USSR a society of genuine prosperity for the working people. An abundant, developed USSR would be the best argument for socialism. Stalin understood this well. For him, world communism increasingly became an instrument for strengthening the USSR. Trotsky and the Trotskyists looked at the USSR differently as the base of the world revolution. And what about Litvinov? A lot depended on Litvinov as the official head of Soviet foreign policy. At that time, Stalin was up to his neck in the internal construction of the country, and in external affairs he relied on Litvinov, on Daddy, an old revolutionary, an Iskra agent, a friend of the famous party militant Komo, a native of a Brest-Litovsk Jewish family. Mir Wallach. Maxim Litvinov, after October, followed the diplomatic path. A telegram from the first People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs after the revolution, Trotsky, appointed Litvinov as our first plenipotentiary representative in England, where he then lived with his wife. Since then, Maxim Maximovich has done a lot to strengthen the position of the USSR. However, in his own way, he was a complex nature, and Litvinov saw the Soviet Union in many ways as the hope of a world revolution. The way of thinking is purely Trotskyist, and for this reason Litvinov's soul was given very secretly not to Stalin, but to Trotsky, although he was never a member of any opposition. Here his diplomatic instincts always helped him out. He was not devoid of another flair, a local one. Here are his close people in the People's Commissariat of Foreign Affairs. The historian Rothstein, the chief secretary of the People's Commissariat for Foreign Affairs Gershelman, Rivlin's personal stenographer. However, there was a long tradition here. Even during the First Russian Revolution, Rachel Rosenzweig was his personal contact, and in 1908 in London he disappeared in the aristocratic mansion of a businessman from Russia, Wolf Leibovich Feitelson. From then on, Litvinov gravitated toward France, England, and the Anglo-Saxons in general. There were also deep personal reasons for this. In 1916, at the age of 40, the still unknown, plump, reddish Russian nihilist immigrant married a young English woman from a decent family, the granddaughter of a colonel in the English army, promising novelist Ivy Lowe, a tall, slender brunette with moving features and dewy dark eyes. So, Litvinov's love for English had a completely material embodiment and a pleasantly tangible one. Although here, too, the innate instinct of a local internationalist did not let him down. His young wife came from a family of Hungarian Jews who fought on the side of Lajos Kossuth and emigrated with him to England. As a practical politician, Litvinov was of course concerned about the fate of Soviet power. Moreover, without the USSR factor, the fate of Western democracies was in question. And they, the fate of England, France, the fate of Europe, worried Litvinov more and more, because over the years Maxim Litvinov became increasingly miervolik. The revolutionary Leninist was overshadowed by the happy husband of the English woman Ivy, a friend of the Frenchman Edward Herriot and, as they say, a hidden Trotskyist. Perhaps no less important here was the blood factor. The German Hitler at the head of Germany was unacceptable to the Jew-wolic, and Hitler was coming to power. Of course, already during the time of Chicherin, Litvinov differed with the latter in his views on what was more important for Russia, Germany or France. Now, having replaced Chicherin as People's Commissar, Litvinov did not hesitate anymore. He did not want to have good relations with Hitler's Germany, even if Germany had chosen Hitler. Litvinov was ready to build relations with France, England and the USA, and tried with all his might, on a normal interstate basis. Although the first two countries were clearly interested in our raw materials and we easily had a positive trade balance with them even without much diplomatic effort. The elite of the democratic West hated our political system, but without purchasing raw materials from the USSR, Europe would have had a hard time. The states, the largest power of capital, lived well without us, did not officially recognize the USSR, and with them a hard line was more correct. Americans are pragmatists. If any of their positive steps towards the USSR were beneficial to them, they took them without any courtesy from the People's Commissariat for Foreign Affairs. And if there was no benefit, as they say, sorry. In all three main countries of the former Entente, that is, in the USA, England and France, anti-Sovietism was strong, not to mention anti-communism. Litvinov turned a blind eye to this, and this became the policy of his People's Commissariat. But our relations with Germany, which is closely connected with us economically, were increasingly politicized by Maxim Maximovich. With France, which was of little importance to us, Wallach behaved like a statesman, suppressing emotions in the name of the cause. And with Germany, which is vital for us, as an irreconcilable revolutionary who does not want any compromises with the class enemy. Moreover, even before the Nazis came to power, Litvinov anticipated the situation in advance and laid the foundation for an ongoing, protracted mutual cooling in advance. By this alone he betrayed the interests of the USSR and our peaceful future. Was Germany going to Hitler? Yes. Was Hitler full of anti-Soviet prejudices? Yes. So what was supposed to be the duty of Soviet diplomacy? Of course, try to dispel prejudices and prejudices. Whether or not this great undertaking would have succeeded is another question. But we had to try persistently until the last opportunity. Otherwise we were threatened with war. And instead of patiently explaining the misconceptions of the Germans, Litvinov's cohort brandished articles from the Nazi Angriff and Volkischer Beobachter and stubbornly quoted the same chapter about Russia in the long-written Mein Kampf, and it multiplied and multiplied the already growing boils on the body of Soviet-German relations. Litvinov bowed to France, which provided our 5-year plans with cars worth 3 million. And he frowned in matters with Germany, which added 250 million to our power every year. Who will say now how much in real history we have lost due to the fact that Litvinov's policy increasingly stopped the flow of German equipment for construction projects of the first 5-year plans. In January 1933, Hitler becomes Reich Chancellor. Germany has long been seething under his anti-Soviet speeches and the Kremlin knows it. However, a week before the already predetermined appointment of Hitler, Molotov at the IE session of the USSR Central Executive Committee of the 6th Convocation speaks calmly and clearly. Germany has a special place in our relations with foreign powers. Of all the countries that have diplomatic relations with us, we have had and have the strongest economic ties with Germany. And this is no coincidence. This follows from the interests of both countries. What about Litvinov? The head of government, Molotov, clearly proclaims a course for normal relations with Germany, regardless of what kind of leadership is in power there. But government member Litvinov thinks differently. After one of his trips to Paris, he writes to the ambassador to France Rosenberg, "Dear Marcel Israelovich, I did not record the conversation with Harriet because it was too extensive, touched on many topics and was not of an official nature at all. The People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs on a business trip only talks informally with a waiter in a restaurant, and at least a brief recording of conversations with foreign government officials is his direct official responsibility." It turns out that Litvinov simply committed a serious crime in office. It turns out so. But now, reader, one can only guess who unofficially talked with the French politician Harriet Maxim Litvinov or Mir Wallach, Soviet diplomat or Anglo-Francophile. Premier Molotov focuses on Germany, and People's Commissar Litvinov informs Dear Marcel Israelovich that he told Harriet about our firm decision and desire to move towards further rapprochement with France. And indeed, the theme of the Franco-Soviet Pact began to sound more and more insistently in the press. In conditions when Hitler came to power, loudly denying the Treaty of Versailles, such rare comments could only look like an anti-German demonstration. Litvinov then brought closer the French Minister of Aviation Pierre Cot to Mikhail Tukhachevsky. Although by the mid-1930s the French had all their aviation achievements in the past, in the era of Farman, Voisin and BL Riot, and after working on such a rapprochement, Litvinov immediately began to write a personal note to the German attorney Twardowski. And about what? The entire complex of relations between the two countries is in question, trade is being curtailed, and Litvinov is inflating the incident with two journalists, Lily Kate and Chniak. It is, of course, the equality of nations with equal rights, but is it smart to tease the German imperial eagle by sending Jewish journalists to Berlin? Especially when you consider that they were doing one thing there, adding fuel to the still smoldering fire of disagreement. No, for Litvinov only such a policy is smart and correct. Molotov and Stalin were more concerned about turbines. Litvinov is different. Goebbels' journalists were eager to go to the USSR and he, grinning, discouraged them from us. Why? What if they see something that could change the attitude of Hitler and the Nazis to life in the USSR? What if Nazi propaganda writes something positive about the Soviet Union? After this, how is it appropriate and inappropriate to commemorate the Eastern chapter? The People's Commissar and his deputies did not lag behind. A month after Hitler came to power, on February 27, 1933, the German ambassador to the USSR von Dirksen burst into the office of Nikolai Krestinsky with a joyful look. "I have good news, Mr. Krestinsky. On behalf of Reich Chancellor Hitler, Foreign Minister von Rath instructed me to have a confidential conversation with the Soviet government about our relations and the world situation in general." Krestinsky was silent, as if he had filled his mouth with water. However, looking at him, one might think that in the Deputy People's Commissar's mouth there was not even water, but God knows how a cockroach had got there, which he did not want to spit out solely out of reluctance to violate diplomatic protocol. Dirksen cooled down a bit but still continued with a smile on his face. I would very much like to once again be received by Mr. Molotov and directly explain to him the position of the German government in relation to the USSR. Krestinsky was silent, but Dirksen was not embarrassed and spoke with such confidence that it was clear that he was following the instructions exactly. The ambassador seemed to be reading a prepared text. The German government believes that the conclusion of a pact between the USSR and France will not affect our relations. How could it be otherwise? Krestinsky finally raised his voice. You see, we have had some doubts in recent weeks. It seemed that there was a bias in Soviet foreign policy towards France to the detriment of Germany. Such doubts are unfounded, perhaps, but judge for yourself. Of course, it is clear to the awesome that the initiative for rapprochement comes from France, and it is quite natural that the USSR does not reject it. You see, let me note in parentheses, reader, that the initiative also came from Litvinov, so Dirksen didn't just blurt out, immediately objecting to Krestinsky. Yes, however, it seems too awesome that there was a well-known initiative on the Soviet side. Proof? Well, firstly, Harriet's print campaign. Further, Litvinov's first speech in Geneva was based in part on the Harriet Plan, and the entire foreign press called Litvinov the only supporter of the French disarmament plan. Yes, because it provides us with peace of mind in the Far East. Awesome understands this, but we also see that your approaches to the problem of security are changing. Actually, this also follows from Litvinov's interview with Luciani. As we see, reader, the unofficial and not recorded on paper Parisian get-togethers of Litvinov and Harriet yielded quite official and not very useful results for us in Berlin. Krestinsky winced. He got up from the sofa, walked around the office, and for some reason rearranged the paperweight on the table. Dirksen waited patiently. Krestinsky, still pacing, objected irritably. Mr. Ambassador, the press is too sensitive an issue to touch upon even indirectly. You also write and say a lot of things, and not school teachers either. Dirksen was a diplomat of the old school, although he was not old himself, just over 50. At the age of 35, he traveled around the world: Africa, India, Japan, China, the States, Brazil and Argentina. As a lieutenant in World War I, the future ambassador earned the Iron Cross. He became a diplomat at the age of 42 and succeeded in this path. He knew Krestinsky, his peer, quite well because he had worked in Moscow for a long time. The ambassador had a reserved attitude towards Hitler and Nazism, but even after the establishment of the Nazi regime he worked and behaved loyally, not in relation to Hitler but in relation to his homeland, Germany. Now he tiredly rubbed his eyes, squinted and briefly waved his hand and said, the German government is aware that the internal development of Germany over the past year has worried the Soviet government. But here the ambassador's voice grew stronger and became firm. On the other hand, my government hopes for an understanding that the fight against communism within the Reich can go hand in hand with maintaining good foreign policy relations with the USSR. How is this possible? Krestinsky responded sarcastically. Just like it is the case with Turkey, with Italy. If I'm not mistaken, it was under Mussolini that Italy established diplomatic relations with you. The main thing is the economy. Our economic cooperation has continued in recent months and has good prospects. Finally, von Reth, von Schleicher and von Papen more than once said what I just said. Now the Reich Chancellor in Germany is Hitler, Krestinsky muttered. Dirksen immediately perked up and responded in a friendly manner. Minister Reth recently had a detailed conversation with Reich Chancellor Hitler regarding future policy towards the USSR. Hitler stated that he did not want to make any changes in foreign policy and economic relations with the USSR. A sharp distinction must be made between domestic policies and foreign relations. Krestinsky appears to have another cockroach in his mouth. Dirksen understood and began to bow. I understand that I have already tired you, but I would like to at least have a detailed exchange of opinions next time. Yes, Krestinsky spat out the interruption, but it didn't make him any more cheerful. We'll put it off until the next date in the next few days. That's so, reader. Soviet diplomacy did not then have a more important, vitally important task than to preserve and ideally strengthen interstate relations between Soviet Russia and now Nazi Germany. After all, Hitler became Reich Chancellor within the framework of a completely legal situation after the victory of his party in the parliamentary elections to the Reichstag. He, of course, went to victory, including with anti-Soviet slogans, but it was all the more important and urgent to rectify the situation in practical terms. Dirksen was telling the truth. The main thing is the economy. However, the coming days came only in a month. On April 3, Krestinsky received Dirksen and the German military attaché Hartmann. Outwardly, Litvinov's deputy was amiable this time, but even he laid down harshly. During the time that had passed since his last meeting with Dirksen, Hitler managed to deliver on March 23 his famous speech on German foreign policy, where the part that concerned Russia was only positive. As if knowing nothing about this, as if not remembering the previous conversation with Dirksen, Krestinsky immediately stated, "Close cooperation between the Reichswehr and the Red Army has been going on for more than 11 years. I was at the cradle of this cooperation. I continue to promote it and am well acquainted with all the moments of improvement and deterioration of relations. And I must say that there has never been a more difficult general political atmosphere than today." Krestinsky really knew the history of the development of military ties between the USSR and Germany. But when he said that he was helping them even now, he was lying. On the contrary, now he was tearing them down. How it disrupted the possibility of normal interstate cooperation in general. And so Dirksen waited in vain for a personal meeting with Molotov. Krestinsky did not consider such a meeting useful, not for normal relations with Germany, but for the development of events that Litvinov and Trotsky needed. This is exactly what the agreement looks like in the book Development, which is needed. Approx. Lenok 555. Krestinsky was later tried for torpedoing the Soviet-German dialogue in the interests of the Trotskyists. Well, the official records of his conversations with Dirksen prove that Litvinov's deputy was not tried in vain. Trotsky did not need the USSR, led by Stalin and Molotov, to come to an agreement with Hitler. If earlier Hitler was not very convenient for Trotsky, now, when Hitler began to become synonymous with the Reich, everything changed radically for the Trotskyists. Counting on the overthrow of Stalin from within, Trotsky wanted to have the German card in his pocket. Is this why Litvinov accepted Dirksen instead of Molotov? He also received and scolded him for Hitler's election speeches in which he attacked German and other communists and the USSR in addition. Hitler's speeches had one goal: to ensure Nazi victory in the March elections to the Reichstag. Of course, Litvinov's department understood this very well, and in internal discussions the kid did not attach serious importance to them. Krestinsky himself admitted in a letter to Kinchek, "I am convinced that after the elections, Hitler, his associates and his press will stop or, in any case, weaken their attacks on the USSR." But was it really possible to miss a convenient reason for feigned indignation? They didn't let him through, writing note after note so that the tension would not subside even after the elections. Krestinsky played against Germany often quite openly, both because he acted in the interests of his unofficial political boss Trotsky, and because, as a supporting figure, he could allow himself some liberties. His official boss Litvinov was forced to play a more subtle game. He seemed to smile at the Germans, but in fact he broke with them as much as was possible at that time. On March 3, shortly after the Reichstag fire, Hitler made one of these speeches which immediately became the talk of the town for the Litvinov Guard. And the day before, on March 1, Litvinov himself, at the Berlin embassy, calmly sipped fragrant coffee with breath and, in good spirits, said to his German colleague, "I am surprised by the comments of your press to my speech in Geneva. I am credited with supporting the French plan while Oh, leave it alone, Mr. Litvinov. I don't blame you. This press. If only we paid attention to it." Nrit paused and looked slyly at Litvinov, clearly hinting at the exceptionally evil tone of the news from Germany in the Soviet press. But it was difficult for Litvinov to get through with irony, and he immediately turned the conversation to something else. "Do you want an anecdotal story?" The owner of a carousel near Paris transformed the brave Tsar's cavalry guard into a Red Army soldier. And there is no end to those who want to appear in an embrace with a Red Russian. I will repay you in the same coin. Ruth laughed in the same tone. The Führer also wouldn't mind being photographed by this carousel driver of yours. Speeches are speeches, but he knows how to distinguish between communism and your state. Hindenburg, by the way, is of the same opinion. Litvinov immediately became serious and said, "We don't see this." Papen offered Harriet a common platform for the fight against communism in Germany and Eastern Europe. Harriet himself told me about this. But this is just empty chatter between us. Perhaps you are losing sight of the fact that there are certain industrial groups in France and Germany who have long been obsessed with plans for an Anglo-French-German union for the production of coal, iron and steel. This is a long-standing obsession, for example, of Arnold Rechberg since the time of the Versailles dictatorship. Just an obsession, sure. And it's not even about the burden of past history. France is simply of little interest to us as a partner. Her star is setting while yours. Litvinov was silent for a long time, and Ruth clasped his hands as if remembering something, and on the contrary perked up. I want to warn you. The Reich Chancellor may be harsh towards you in his speeches before the elections, but this, alas, is the reality of election tactics. As soon as the Reichstag is convened, the Führer will make a declaration in a spirit friendly to you. The fact is, reader, that early parliamentary elections were scheduled for March 5, 1933. Hitler wanted to consolidate his victory and consolidated it by receiving 288 seats in the Reichstag instead of the existing 196. Litvinov understood all this but again remained silent. But upon returning to Moscow, he immediately gave instructions. React to any attack from Hitler immediately and officially. And they reacted. Great friend of the USSR Edward Harriet was not a stupid man. Yes, and not bad. He loved his France and naturally wanted peace and tranquility. Harriet did not like communists, but he thought soberly. He believed that his dear old Gaul could sleep peacefully only when she was covered by the shield of the Soviet-French alliance. Yes, Edward Harriet is known among us for the fact that, having become Prime Minister and at the same time Minister of Foreign Affairs, he established diplomatic relations with the USSR in 1924. But for France this act was much more necessary in the future than for us. Exactly. This is what the French ambassador to the USSR, Jean Herbert, wrote to his minister on October 24, 1925. You have opened the door through which France must pass in order to avoid mortal danger to its integrity and independence. Our salvation lies only in establishing and maintaining relations with the now resurgent Russia that would exclude, think about it, reader, SK. Russian-German cooperation against France and against the friends of France. At that time, Chicherin was still at the helm of the NKVD. 10 years later, under the People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs Litvinov, Harriet's friend, this program will become a reality. Soviet-Polish and Soviet-French non-aggression pacts were signed, and even a mutual assistance agreement was signed with Czechoslovak Prime Minister Benes. No matter what anyone says, these documents practically did not strengthen the security of the USSR, but they actually weakened Germany's European positions. Harriet and Herbert could be pleased. They understood the salt of the European situation perfectly, and Herbert did not hesitate to openly write to Harriet. We are a continental nation and cannot live free if there is no balance on the continent. However, balance will become impossible on the day when Germany and Russia, both reborn, find themselves on the same scale. For the French, everything is said here, and perhaps it's true. The longtime enemy of the Gaul is the Prussian, the Boche. Therefore, any alliance between Russia and France must sooner or later turn into an alliance against Germany. Harriet understood this. Litvinov could not help but understand this. And besides, they understood each other well. Harriet took advantage of every opportunity to sow mutual suspicion, better yet mutual distrust, and even better, enmity between Germany and the USSR. The old Gaul understood that the coming of anti-Versailles No. 1 Hitler to power was a matter of months, and that's why Harriet is trying to make a pact with us. But at the same time, he simply blackmails his friend Litvinov with an ultimatum. They say, we will not sign a trade agreement without a pact. USSR plenipotentiary representative in France Rosenberg is in panic, although Harriet was just bluffing. The French signed the pact a week later and the trade agreement a year later. Before Hitler had time to exchange his chancellorship, Harriet already declared on February 9. I attach great importance to the rapprochement of the French and Soviet democracies to fight fascism. And the applause of the French merged with the joyful news of this statement reported by Marcel Israelovich Rosenberg to the kid of the USSR. What was there to be happy about? Anti-Soviet, anti-German provocation by Harriet. Provocations in their purest form. But they were happy because Litvinov didn't even want the most beneficial alliance with Germany for us. No state interests could obscure from the former local Jew wallet the immutable truth that a regime organically hostile to Jewry had come to power in Germany. Nazism could be as loyal to the USSR as it wanted. It could be extremely important for the USSR economically. This did not matter to Wallach. An alliance with Hitler, even if it was vitally necessary for the USSR, Wallach, I repeat, could not allow. Within the country, he was far from alone in such sentiments. At that time, many in the USSR worked for a future break with Germany, for cooling relations with Germany, to the best of their ability and level of power. Very characteristic in this sense is the provocation of Karl Radek, carried out in his typical style, Jesuitically, brilliantly and gracefully. In the summer of 1933, Radek was on a visit to Poland and visited the new Polish port of Gdynia. Gdynia was one of the hallmarks of the Versailles system. Built adjacent to Danzig, it ended the Polish corridor to the Baltic, and there, signing the Book of Honored Visitors, the cunning Karl found it possible to write, "The sea connects Poland and the USSR," a seemingly harmless phrase, and geographically accurate. But when the Germans learned about it, they immediately rose up, and there was a reason. Before the defeat of Germany in the First World War, the Poles had not had any sea for several centuries. It appeared in Poland only due to the fact that the Entente at Versailles cut the body of Germany with a non-healing cut of the Polish corridor. And Poland itself appeared thanks to the victory of the United States and the Entente in the First World War and Versailles. That is, that factor, even an indirect mention of which could infuriate any German. What can we say about Hitler? Radek's phrase killed three birds with one stone. Firstly, in the mouth of a semi-disgraced but major Soviet figure, a subtle hint about the corridor and Versailles automatically irritated the Germans in general, and Hitler in particular. Secondly, this could be understood in such a way that in the USSR, instead of the previous categorical condemnation of Versailles, they began to approve of it. And finally, thirdly, Radek's innocent phrase could easily be regarded as a promise of support for Poland in rejecting very possible future steps by Germany to solve the problem of the corridor and Danzig. You can't say anything. Even though Radek was a pure son of a bitch, he had his head on his shoulders for good reason. And he undoubtedly acted this way out of malicious intent. After all, he had one specialization, a torchbearer for the world revolution. And what about Litvinov? Let's say he didn't have any malicious intentions but followed the dictates of the blood instinct. Hitler was indeed very harsh in his assessment of Jewry, and now he was gaining power in the largest European power. People's Commissar Litvinov should have been concerned about this insofar as it could have damaged, first of all, the economic ties of Germany with the USSR. But as long as the Führer's racial policy remained a purely internal matter of the Germans, the Soviet economy was neither hot nor cold. Without advertising this approach, Stalin and Molotov still adhere to it. But could me or Wallach have been indifferent? Probably not. Well, then we can talk about a tragic split personality. But then it was necessary to resign from the post of People's Commissar. Litvinov remained and increasingly led our foreign policy into a swamp. Ahead were years of persistent divorce between the USSR and the Reich, years of fruitless fuss with the stillborn idea of collective security in an alliance with France, England and their meaningless European satellites Czechoslovakia and Poland. The alliance with the Entente that never emerged had no results, unless the vile anti-Sovietism of Europe has finally become clear. As for the divorce with the Germans, the result could have been more serious. War. Harriet tirelessly, verbally and in print, drove a wedge between the Reich and the USSR and tried to move us to France. Well, he didn't act very nicely, but he acted like a patriot. It's clear, a patriot of France. Litvinov, playing along more and more with him, acted like a state criminal. But all the threads of the USSR's foreign policy were still in his hands. At first glance, Litvinov pursued an active policy. Just what kind of activity was this? How much effort was put into concluding a number of Franco-Soviet agreements alone? Did they guarantee our safety even by a centime? As the future showed, the French did not even want to fight for their own dear France. So would they really fight the Germans for the USSR? Of course not. There was no reason to fear the opposite, that is, such an alliance between France and Germany that the French would go to war against us. They had already had plenty of this jelly in Odessa in 1919 during the intervention. No, it's your choice, reader, but I can't attribute Litvinov's pacts with the fatherland of Edward Harriet to our great success. Quite the contrary, because such a turn could not bring much joy to the Germans. But in their hearts they had no malice towards us. Still, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, it was not Stalin who mocked them, but Clemenceau. The People's Commissariat for Foreign Affairs of Litvinov concluded a non-aggression pact with Poland. What if I hadn't concluded? The times of Babel's unkempt First Army cavalrymen are over. Moreover, even then Babel described not the combat personnel, but the transport workers. By the first half of the 1930s, the combat power of the Red Army and the troops of the gentry and arrogant Poland were already incomparable. So if the lop-stached Pilsudski had risked turning his gaze to Kiev again, Western Ukraine and Western Belarus would have reunited with the USSR 5 to 6 years earlier. That's all. But it was not enough for Litvinov to ensure our safety from this side. He also strung on his diplomatic dove a whole bunch of conventions on the definition of aggression with Estonia, Latvia, Romania, Turkey, Persia, Afghanistan, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia and Lithuania. All these conventions were conducted as they were reported at the end in London in July 1933. The titles of presidents, imperial and royal majesties shown in the texts. The only thing missing here was the rulers of Siam and Gerias. Indirectly, these conventions also quarreled us with Germany, because Lithuania, for example, received from Versailles a purely German mammal, what today's Lithuania calls Klaipėda. As for Estonia and Latvia, maybe we really should have guaranteed them, as defined in the conventions, inviolability, neutralizing the possibility of their capture by the same Germany. No, and here the idea was not worth the trouble. If Hitler did not want to quarrel with us over these limit trophies when he was already stronger, then even more so he would not have encroached on them in the mid-1930s. But these conventions caused dull irritation among the Germans. Alas, Litvinov's activity in minor matters covered up his sabotage of the most important problem, restoring and strengthening relations with the new Germany. And then the Soviet Union needed this even more than Germany itself. The Germans could, for example, reduce the import of our raw materials and food, which had an unpleasant effect on our solvency. The Germans could afford it. They sold us not just goods but the industrial basis for our economic independence in the future. The French are a different matter. Not to mention the British. At the end of April, the English King George V issued a decree imposing an embargo on the import of Soviet goods. This was a reaction to the conviction in Moscow of 6 English employees of the Metropolitan Vickers Company. And on July 1, the embargo was lifted. The British held out for exactly 2 months. They could not live without Russian forest for more than a century. And this semi-anecdotal embargo alone proved, we don't have to worry too much about English, and even French, disposition. It was already ensured by the economic interest of England and France in trading with us. And still Dirksen waited for the conversation with Molotov. True, due to sabotage by Krestinsky and Litvinov, he waited until the end of his Moscow service. The Soviet premier received the ambassador on August 4, 1933, and soon the German left Moscow, receiving an appointment in Tokyo. Entering Molotov's office, the seasoned diplomat was so visibly worried that Molotov even noted this in the official recording of the conversation. However, it is not surprising. Dirksen served as ambassador to Moscow for 5 years. And what years? Over the years, Germany and the USSR have become unrecognizable. The Weimar Republic ended ingloriously. Her grayness was only emphasized by the shine of the diamond necklaces on the chests of the blonde friends of the moist-eyed Nouveau Reich. And now the eroticism of tango for the elite was replaced in Germany by the march of millions. The USSR, from a half-power, half-farm, softened like overcooked dough, turned into an industrial giant in 5 years. He devoured steel, machine tools, dynamos and nickel purer than the Rabelaisian gargantua of caves. Dirksen, a traveler, a soldier, a diplomat, understood well what could be achieved by combining the economic potential of the new Germany with the capabilities of the new USSR. And with growing bitterness, he saw how these dizzying prospects were missed by both sides, but especially by the Soviet one. Restrained according to protocol, he could not express this pain to Molotov and was worried from the very first phrase. Mr. Molotov, I'm leaving in a few days, and I attach great importance to today's visit. I am sincerely sorry, Mr. Dirksen, that Soviet-German relations are losing such a good supporter. We regarded your work as fruitful and in line with the interests of both countries. I am sincerely grateful for the high appreciation of my efforts, Mr. Molotov. I can assure you that this line fully corresponds not only to my thoughts and feelings but also to the instructions of my government. Molotov looked searchingly at Dirksen, and he, understanding this in his own way, quickly said, "If you now think about Goebbels' interview, published in England and reproduced today by Izvestia, then I am convinced that Goebbels did not make the statement about the Treaty of Rapallo that is attributed to him. You see, he cannot refuse interviews, and the Anglo-Saxon press is considered free, and she really handles interview texts freely. However, I understand your concern, especially considering the situation in Germany in the first months after the National Socialist government took power. However, since then, the Reich Chancellor has not only said but also done a lot of things that have created, in my opinion, all the prerequisites for the normal development of previous relations, Mr. Molotov." Molotov sat in silence, but it suddenly seemed to Dirksen that he was even silent differently from Litvinov. The People's Commissar showed irritation and impatience with all his appearance. Molotov remained silent benevolently and interestedly. He simply listened in order to understand and not to interrupt at a convenient moment. And encouraged by this impression, Dirksen continued. The Reich Chancellor, as you know, in his keynote speech on March 23 spoke about the need for good relations with Russia. After this, in a number of speeches he confirmed and strengthened this idea. This was followed by our practical initiatives. Dirksen said this for a reason, and Molotov knew it. Therefore, his slight movement of his head was very similar to an approving nod. However, this movement was so elusive that Dirksen was not sure of the reaction of the chairman of the Council of People's Commissars and said with conviction, "The prerequisites have been created, but the further the Soviet public goes, the more clearly it shows other tendencies. No, we consider the signing of the Soviet pacts with France and Poland, as well as your London conventions, as a success of your policy that does not harm Germany. But the entire Soviet press is full of such harsh attacks against us that even the harshest articles in the press of other countries cannot be compared with." Dirksen fell silent, gathered his courage, and made up his mind. Without noticing it, he was gradually getting a little excited and therefore began to speak more directly. "I, Mr. Molotov, have been living in Moscow for several years, and not even the third. Your newspapers are always on my table in the morning, because the press is a thermometer. It shows how healthy the body itself is, and I see that lately the body of Soviet society has been in a fever with anti-German fever. There was a sharp turn in the foreign policy of the Soviet Union. It is difficult for me to judge what his reasons are. Perhaps you have special hopes for rapprochement with France and Poland. Molotov again unexpectedly and this time moved disapprovingly. An almost imperceptible shadow ran across his face which Dirksen nevertheless caught. But no objections were heard, and Dirksen, taking more air into his lungs, exhaled. On the other hand, one gets the impression that the internal political Dirksen clearly emphasized this word with his voice and gesture. The struggle against communism in Germany determines the foreign policy line of the Soviet Union. While the foreign policy Dirksen raised his voice again, the Reich's line does not follow its domestic policy. There is reason to believe that the special relations of the USSR with the Communist Party of Germany, that is, party aspects, dominate the foreign policy of the USSR. I would be extremely grateful to you, Mr. Chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, if you would express your point of view and explain the reasons for your emerging hostility towards us. Molotov still looked calm, focused and attentive, and he began just as calmly. The Soviet government is guided by one basic principle: maintaining and strengthening friendly relations with all countries. As for the internal policy of the German government, the Soviet Union firmly followed and continues to pursue the line of non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. But Mr. Molotov, it's unlikely that Man's communists and the communists of, say, Turkey are equally important to you. Molotov was apparently confused but quickly found his way. But in Turkey our citizens are not arrested, searched or subjected to violence. Dirksen nodded understandingly. Yes, but excesses also occurred against citizens of Poland and Czechoslovakia. Everything is explained by general shifts. These are unfortunate costs, and we don't just apologize. After the incident at the Soviet club in Hamburg, Mr. Molotov, we paid you large compensation. Surprise flashed in Molotov's eyes. Litvinov had not reported such an outcome. Therefore, Molotov simply shrugged his shoulders and objected in a very conciliatory tone. Well, that's comforting to hear, but it's not completely reassuring. 1 Hagenberg Memorandum. Here I will use the author's right and divert your attention, reader, from this conversation. The reference to Hagenberg was the result of Litvinov's tendentious information. Maxim Maximovich quickly reported to the top about the incidents in Germany and was not so prompt in reporting their settlement, which is why Molotov did not know anything about the Hamburg compensations. The further conversation about Hagenberg, reader, may not seem very clear to you. Wait, however, until the next chapter, where we will dwell on something and someone, including Hagenberg, in more detail. In the meantime, let's return to Molotov's office. After all, their Dirksen is already eager to explain to his owner, Mr. Molotov, this memorandum is given excessive importance. Moreover, the Reich Chancellor immediately completely disavowed Hagenberg, and the world press paid him great attention. Yes, anti-German. She doesn't have the best attitude towards the USSR either. This, as you always emphasize, is a bourgeois press. Moreover, the memorandum was reproduced in it with a number of clearly malicious distortions. Yes, I read both the newspaper text and the authentic one. You are right, but it would be better not to have any reason for such analysis at all. I agree. However, the reasons arise not only through our fault. For example, not long ago the Soviet public categorically condemned the Treaty of Versailles, and now our course of revising it is regarded by your press as a military threat. Our position on this issue has not changed, perhaps, but Radic wrote in Gdynia that the sea connects Poland and the USSR. This is the first time I've heard this from you, but what's so odious about that? Dirksen remained silent. Molotov was so sincerely surprised. It looked like he really didn't know about Radic's trick. And while the ambassador was thinking, Molotov continued, but is it possible to ignore such a fact as Goebbels' interview, where he puts Rapallo and Versailles on the same level? Dirksen heatedly interrupted the Prime Minister. I am sure that this, as in the case of Hagenberg, is a newspaper fake. At the end of May I spoke in Berlin with the Reich Chancellor, with Ministers Göring, Frick and others, with Goebbels too. Everyone has a very positive attitude towards the development of German-Soviet relations. I hope this conversation will help eliminate all friction and misunderstandings. I am very grateful that you took the time to meet in person. Molotov stood up, saying goodbye. Dirksen also stood up, more excited by the conversation than before it began. Extending his hand to Molotov, he still could not resist. "It's unlikely that we'll see each other soon, Mr. Molotov, if we see each other at all. So let me say goodbye informally and from the bottom of my heart. It is impossible to be friends with everyone in our cruel world. Friends are easy to lose but not only harder to gain. They may never be found to replace those lost." After Dirksen left, Molotov stood for a long time, looking at the closed door. Then he sat down in the chair again and thought, "Let's leave him alone, reader, and try to figure something out for ourselves." Vyacheslav Molotov was then 43 years old. He was born in the Vyatka settlement of Kukarka in the family of a clerk in 1890. That year, young Herbert von Dirksen crossed the threshold of the Berlin Gymnasium of Emperor Wilhelm. Molotov, at that time, however, Scriabin, began studying at the first Kazan school at the age of 12, and at 19 he was arrested and sent to Vologda for 2 years. Dirksen was traveling around the world at this time. After exile, the young Vyatichi entered the St. Petersburg Polytechnic Institute but completed the course of study in a different faculty. Party work, arrests, party work, legal zvezda, semi-legal pravda, arrests, Duma election campaign of the Bolsheviks, arrests. He wrote the diploma for this university course in practice in the Siberian village of Manzarka, Irkutsk province, in exile. After escaping from there in May 1916, the young specialist Molotov received, on Lenin's recommendation, an assignment to the Russian Bureau of the party's Central Committee. Molotov, perhaps, did not really consider the events of October 1717. He prepared them. The member of the Military Revolutionary Committee really had no time for historical observations. His daily work was enough for him. In fact, year after year she was then in over her head, the authorized representative of the Central Committee on the Volga in the civil, later Nizhny Novgorod, Donbass, Kharkov, plus the opposition on the right, the opposition on the left. At 31 he is secretary of the Central Committee, at 36 a member of the Politburo, at 40 chairman of the Council of People's Commissars of the USSR and the Council of Labor and Defense. Over 20 years of such chaos, he, of course, gained some diplomatic experience. But where was he compared to Chicherin, who received standing ovations at the Genoa conference after brilliant speeches in French and English and wrote literary sketches about Mozart? Maxim Litvinov was a weaker linguist than Chicherin, but he also communicated with his English wife and friend Harriet without an interpreter. He also knew German, like every Jew from the Western Russian outskirts. Litvinov also knew Europe firsthand, not from official visits but from emigration. Moreover, in the Chikerinsky and then in the Litvinovsky kid, Litvinov was no exception in this regard. A group of party intellectuals, a match for both people's commissars, gathered there. These were revolutionary cosmopolitans, not just citizens of the world but citizens of the new world for which they worked. The USSR of the first years was for them not so much a center but only a part of this coming world, and even if it is the center, then only as the main base, as a striking force. Europe, however, after the revolutionary outburst, although it was seething, did not boil. The diplomats of the revolution had to deal with the routine work of foreign policy support for state building. At first they coped well with this matter and earned authority from this both outside the cordon and at home. Yes, actually, what were the tasks then? Break through political isolation, achieve diplomatic recognition of the USSR. There was no particular need to deal with alcohol impurities and changes in interest rates on loans in the first years of the existence of the People's Commissariat of Foreign Affairs. Wandering from one European or even Asian capital to another, they happily avoided participating in internal party struggles. There were not so many formal oppositionists and Trotskyists among them. A major exception was Christian Rakovsky, but this was a diplomatic cadre of the first call. In short, they trusted the kid without interfering much in its work, because diplomacy is only a slightly less delicate matter than intelligence. No wonder they always go hand in hand. Relations with different countries were different, but basically the same. Mussolini's fascist Italy did not stand out from the general series here, including in terms of the nature of the state's attitude to the Jewish issue. A new situation arose only when Germany abruptly and quickly abandoned Weimar parliamentarism and entrusted its fate to a pronounced authoritarian personality, Hitler. And from the very beginning of his political career, he not only did not hide but emphasized both his fundamental authoritarianism and anti-Jewishness. I don't want to make excuses, a fact is a fact, and I won't bore you, reader, with a list of the names of Jews in the leadership of the NKVD of the USSR and our foreign intelligence by the 1930s. Let's just say that this list was depressingly large and high-ranking. But, by the way, I also want to refute the narrow-minded, loud-mouthed anti-Semites who passionately denounce the Jewish dominance in the Bolshevik Council of Deputies. There is a completely rational and objective explanation for the high percentage of Jews in the external, diplomatic and intelligence bodies of the Soviet Union. Jews have long lived in Russia in the border areas, and among the Bolshevik Jews there were, naturally, more of those who knew both European customs and European languages. It was easier for them to provide themselves with an intelligence cover, including through family ties. Remember the story of Dmitry Bystreltov. And there would, perhaps, not have been a big disaster in such a large share of one nationality if, firstly, it had not been for Hitler, who became the head of Germany. For the peoples of the USSR, for Stalin and Molotov as their leaders, Hitler's Nazi Germany could still remain a partner. First of all, economic. But for the leading and writing revolutionary cosmopolitan Jews in the USSR, this was in no way possible. A major exception here was Lazar Kaganovich, and this only confirmed the general principle. Secondly, again, it's not a matter of likes and dislikes but a matter of fact, and the fact was that among the Trotskyists, who also could not be allowed a strong Soviet-German alliance under the leader of the USSR Stalin, Jews were also in an increased percentage. This is, perhaps, why the intelligence department of the General Staff of the Red Army, already in the early 1930s, shrewdly identified Germany as the main potential enemy, and the NKVD of the USSR did not disagree with it in its assessment. Obviously, the powerful Jewish layer in the Comintern also had its significance. However, in fact, the serendipity was explained by the fact that even before Hitler came to power, very influential circles in the USSR persistently and consistently made Germany a potential enemy. Articles by journalists, poems by poets, reports from intelligence officers and diplomats, and speeches by major party and state elites worked for this. The fact that Trotsky, and besides him and some others in Moscow, were not averse to making secret acquaintance with Nazi Germany, did not refute anything that was just said. In these circles it was believed, firstly, that the world had not come down on Hitler like a wedge. In Germany the situation was still very much in flux. The old Reichswehr generals enjoyed great influence, and many of them were quite familiar with a number of Red Army generals grouped around Tukhachevsky. Secondly, it was possible to reach an agreement on certain conditions with Hitler. After all, his connections with Jewish banking circles were a fact. The main thing is that it was impossible to allow normal relations between Germany and the USSR as long as it was Stalin's USSR. And Molotov did not see this new moment then, and he could hardly have seen it then. At that time, a lot of energy and attention was distracted by the internal situation. It filled Molotov's working days and nights just as it filled Stalin's days and nights. And even if Molotov saw something, he did not give way to such thoughts because opposition could not only complicate the main efforts but also completely sweep away even Molotov. The label of an open well-wisher of Nazi Germany and an ill-wisher of the ideas of the world revolution. This was a serious matter in Moscow in the first half of the 1930s. But as for Radek's subtle hints, Dirksen's guess was correct. Molotov really simply did not attach any importance to the Jesuit Grinia note. He was simply not experienced in such games. But others were tempted. The same press, for example. After all, even until the end of the 1930s, its elite part was, in fact, Trotskyist. The predominance of the same Jews in it only complemented the general character of Moscow newspapermen eager to go to Warsaw, as Tukhachevsky once called, and to Bombay through London, as Lev Davidovich did. The internationalist Mikhail Koltsov freely and turned out to be just one of the most striking manifestations here. To prevent Hitler's ties with Germany from developing at any cost was even more important and natural for them than for Litvinov. Willy-nilly, he had to somehow take into account the state interest. A chemical column will not work worse if the concern that supplied it supports Hitler and not Rothschild. But the Berlin journalist of Izvestia or the representatives of Pravda in the imperial capital of the Reich, Kogan, Hartmann and Chniak. What was holding them back, besides the editors, who differed from them only in that they were based in Moscow and not in Berlin? Formally, Soviet diplomacy and the press gradually and imperceptibly acquired increasingly anti-state significance. What about Stalin? But Stalin still had the country in his hands, his own, the only thing important and possible for him. Here is the life of Stalin and the country in 1933. The first All-Union Congress of Collective Farmers, the commissioning of the White Sea Canal, the Chelyabinsk tractor plant, Uralmash, the first Azovstal blast furnace, the Moscow and Leningrad meat processing plants, the Bobrikovsky chemical plant. The first current was provided by Sergius, Ryangis, Dobrovskaya. The first 5-year plan was ending and it was necessary to prepare the second. Stalin was not very keen on the ideas of a world fire before. He came to the revolution not as an intellectual, but as a genius nugget from among the humiliated and insulted. That is, as a genius who not only sympathizes with the people, but is oppressed spiritually and physically along with them. Having become the leader of this people in his own homeland, he became increasingly interested in the organization of practical life in it. Trotsky and his entire immediate cohort were ideologists who wrote concepts in broad strokes. To understand the reason for the failures with the development of some aircraft engine. Excuse me, gentlemen. Comrades, but this is a matter for specialists. Moreover, among some technical specialists, Trotsky was more popular than Stalin. Many engineers of the old training remained, some a little, some a lot, bars and involuntarily gravitated towards the master Trotsky. In addition, due to technical illiteracy, it would be easy for Trotsky and Zinoviev to rule if Trotsky became the head of the country. Stalin, on the other hand, did not hesitate to study textbooks for mechanics and fitters. He himself had never been a mechanic, and the country was changing from calico to steel. And last but not least, thanks to him, the country studied, Stalin studied, and then it turned out that Stalin understood many technical problems in such a way that the artillerymen were surprised at his artillery knowledge, aircraft builders at his aviation knowledge, and tank crews at his tank knowledge. The ideas of revolution somewhere out there, in other places on the planet, faded in his soul. Was it before them when the paths of great internal revolutions were outlined? Industrial, agricultural, scientific, technical, cultural. On the eve of the new year 1934, Stalin talked with New York Times correspondent Dranty. To the question, "What is the most important problem for you?" Stalin replied, "Trade turnover between city and village, and transport, especially rail. Solving these issues is not easy, but it is easier than those we have already solved. The industrial problem has been solved. The collective farm and peasant problem, the most difficult, can also be considered solved. Now, trade and transport. I'm sure we can handle this too. We managed to cope, but at the expense of overload." On September 12, 1933, Stalin wrote to Molotov, "I am somewhat embarrassed that I was the reason for your early return from vacation. But if we ignore this awkwardness, it is clear that leaving the central work to Kaganovich alone, Kubyshev can drink for a long time. Bearing in mind that Kaganovich must be torn between local and central work means acting recklessly. I have finally become convinced that you should not go to Turkey. Let Vroshelov and Litvinov go." The Bolshevik Koba still trusted the Bolshevik Papasha and still left foreign affairs to him. After all, Dad did a good job to ensure that we were recognized in the outside world and began to be taken seriously. But Litvinov no longer deserved the Kremlin's trust. Stalin's domestic policy worked to strengthen the USSR economically. This means she was world-oriented. Litvinov's foreign policy increasingly impeded our rapid internal development, and that means she worked for the future war. Chapter 10. Deterring soil sets the Reichstag on fire. Kite from Izvestia extinguishes the fire with kerosene. 1933. The year Hitler came to power deserves to take a closer look at it, and therefore let's return to these days again. Everyone knows that shortly after Reich President Hindenburg appointed Hitler as Reich Chancellor, the Reichstag building went up in flames on February 27. But who set it on fire and why? It would seem that the classically accurate answer is given by the telegram of Plenipotentiary Kinchuk to the People's Commissariat of Foreign Affairs of the USSR dated February 28. The Reichstag arson was undoubtedly carried out by the Nazis in order to defeat the Communist Party and for their success in the elections. By the way, at the same time Kinchuk reported about a search in the apartment of Izvestia correspondent Kate. More will be said about her. Kinchuk, it seems, was not mistaken. Immediately after the arson, 4,000 communists and liberals were arrested, and on March 3, 2 days before the elections, Thielmann himself found himself behind bars. But on March 1, in the same Berlin, first Litvinov's German colleague von Ruth had a peaceful conversation with the Soviet People's Commissar in his office, and then Litvinov treated Ruth to a cup of coffee at the Soviet embassy. No one threw coffee grounds in each other's faces, so the arson case looked like a purely internal German matter and did not directly concern the USSR. However, on March 3, the same Kinchuk sent another telegram. Which one? Now we will find out about this. But even before quoting it, I will note that one can only shrug at how it did not take its rightful place in historical monographs. I do not rule out, my dear reader, that they prefer not to mention this encryption of the Soviet plenipotentiary even as a version, because even if Kinchuk's message corresponded to reality, then such truth did not suit anyone. The democratic West did not want it to come to light because of its ugliness. For Litvinov and the Comintern, she broke the scheme of events that was convenient for them. Historians of the KSU Central Committee neglected it later, perhaps because this truth did not look ideologically solid enough. The Nazi Prime Minister of Prussia, Göring, benefited from blaming the Communists. Litvinov, the Comintern and the historians of the Central Committee on Göring and the anti-communists. But the problem, reader, apparently, was oil. No, the illumination before the elections to the Reichstag turned out to be useful for the Nazis in their election struggle with the Communists, but this is how the telegram from the Berlin plenipotentiary to Moscow on March 3 began. Information has been received about the instigation of the Reichstag arson by Dettering, who hopes, as a result of the intensification of the fight against communism and the USSR in Germany, to achieve the expulsion of Derup and the implementation of an oil monopoly. The participants are supposed to be his agents. Dettering acted together with Göring. This message, according to our information, will appear in the French and American press. Alas, the sensation was hushed up. It's a pity, because Kinchuk's second telegram reflected the actual motives of what was happening clearly more fully. The burning of the Reichstag may have been beneficial for the Nazis, but it was even more beneficial for Dettering. Even in the oil business, which is already rich in biographies of brilliant adventurers and organizers, the Anglo-Dutch Dettering stood out for his business qualities, crazy morals and dishonesty. This provided him with the highest sovereign crown, not made from laurel and oak leaves but from pieces of a checkbook. It will be useful for us to get to know his personality and, I think, interesting. Henry Wilhelm August Dettering was born in 1866, died in 1939 at 73 years old. In December 1915, he accepted English citizenship while retaining Dutch citizenship. In 1920 he received the title of Sir. Ilya Ehrenberg wrote interestingly about him. Dettering was a Dutchman. He went to Java to seek his fortune and vegetated in the bank as a petty clerk. 5 years later he became the director of Royal Dutch. 10 years later the King of Oil. He penetrated into Mexico, Venezuela, Canada, Romania. One could also add into Tsarist Russia, China, Egypt, Siam, Indonesia, Argentina, Iraq, Indonesia. SK. The British granted him the title of baronet and he turned into Sir Henry. He was a strong, energetic man. He skated almost to death, smoked cheap sailor tobacco in his pipe. He contributed to coups in Mexico, Venezuela, Albania. He probably considered himself an oil Napoleon. One day a journalist asked him what the most important thing in life. Sir Henry answered briefly, oil. The portrait is alive, but it is a portrait painted by the artist's hand. So, academic publications also wrote about deterring in a clearly emotional manner. In a fairly detailed article in volume 21 of the first edition of the Great Soviet Encyclopedia for 1931, deterring was described as follows. The head of the World Oil Concern, Royal Dutch Shell, financier and international adventurer. He quickly emerged with his commercial and organizational skills. English Admiral Fisher introduced D to the British government as a person capable of taking over the implementation of British oil policy. Fisher described D as Napoleon in courage and Cromwell in thoroughness in carrying out his plans. As active as he is unscrupulous in his means, D, however, strives to stay in the shadows, does not report anything about himself to the press or even to ordinary reference books publications. D arouses fierce hatred from his fellow Americans, competitors who see him as the main enemy. English oil Napoleon deterring was truly famous, powerful, ruthless and treacherous. Other royal attributes were also present. Unique cars, country houses, special trains and luxurious beauties in the Rubens custody voluptuous style. Deterring was not afraid of either competitors or Russian-style frosts. Until the end of his life, he broke the ice in the winter, taking cold baths. He loved the oil tycoon and Russian beauties. In Paris, he gave one of them, the wife of the White Guard General Lydia Pavlovna Bagratuni, an emerald tiara from Cartier worth 300,000 then pounds. It was not just a fortune, but a whole dozen decent fortunes. Even Deterring did not have the full amount on hand, and the jewelers agreed to wait. Deterring did not want to wait, and even before the debt was paid off, the Kastodievskaya Russian beauty became his wife, decorating her life not only with the greenery of emeralds but also with the no less attractive greenery of pounds and dollars. Deterring headed the Anglo-Dutch Royal Dutch Shell, merging his Royal Dutch with Marcus Samuel's Shell in 1907. Anglo-Saxon Henry started as a bank clerk in Amsterdam. The Samuel brothers began as shell merchants, where, by the way, comes the shell emblem, a scallop shell, and its very name, shell in English, shell. Representatives of the two chosen peoples began to cooperate in 1902, just when one of the Samuels became the first Jewish lord in the history of England, the Mayor of London. This union could not have happened without the Rothschilds. Through the oil businessman Jelbkian, connections were established with Deutsche Bank, and later, through the Lazar brothers with the Nazis. Living in perfect harmony with a former Russian aristocrat, Deterring hated the new Soviet Russia no less than his wife. And what was there to love for? The Russian Revolution expropriated Shell's fields in the Caucasus, and Soviet oil on world markets interfered with Deterring's business. At the end of 1927, he even started a price war with Standard Oil of New York, which resold our oil to India. 5 years earlier, Deterring disrupted the Hague International Conference of 1922 just when its participants began to agree with Soviet proposals, but Soviet Russia did not agree with the ultimatum demands of the owner of Royal Dutch Shell, who sought from the Soviet government the transfer of our oil fields into a monopoly concession. It's funny that in 1923 he was the first to purchase a shipment of Soviet oil, thus breaking through the general line of boycotting it on world markets. Truly, your deeds are wonderful, Lord, but the deeds of capital are even more wonderful. This involuntary service of Sir Henry to the Soviet regime turned out to be the only one, but his anti-Soviet record was first class both in volume and content. He financed the intervention, took an active part in organizing a bandit raid on the Soviet company Arcos in London, and in May 1927 initiated the severance of Soviet-British diplomatic relations. We will discuss this below. A Georgian workshop of counterfeit Soviet chervonets discovered in Berlin in 1927 also existed thanks to Deterding. And in 1930, he pushed the French Prime Minister Tardieu to sever relations with the USSR. Deterding also quite generously financed Hitler's NSDAP before it came to power. And even shortly before his death, he subsidized pro-German organizations in England and supported the ideas of joint Anglo-German aggression against Russia, which he hated. Ehrenberg wrote, "On the northern ghostly sea, a giant dreadnought smokes gloomily. He rules over 5 parts of the world. This dreadnought is called Great Britain." On the captain's bridge next to the Greek profile of Basil Zakharov, an international arms dealer with whom readers of My Two Versailles are familiar. SK. You can see a Dutch Deterding pipe. Sir Henry declared war on 1/6 of the world. At the time described by Ehrenberg, even if the English dreadnought was controlled by London captains, its course was already plotted according to Washington maps. However, everything was noted correctly about Sir Henry's attitude towards the USSR. For a better understanding of the events covered by the fire in the Reichstag, my dear reader, it does not hurt us to dwell in more detail on the case of the trading company Arcos, All Russian Cooperative Societies Limited, established in London in June 1920 by the Soviet cooperative delegation led by Leonid Kresin. According to the charter, Arcos was a private English joint stock company, the shareholders of which, however, were mainly Soviet state organizations. Arcos fully represented our interests in transactions with English companies, had offices and branches in a number of countries, and enjoyed the status of a legal entity in England. Arcos also had independent subsidiaries and agencies for trading in bread, timber, furs, bristles, and oil. For Sir Henry, any trade with the Soviets was worse than a bitter radish. After all, the Soviets ignored him. And Russian oil on world markets was simply intolerable for him. And so on May 12, 1927, 150 British police officers raided the Arcos office and warehouses. The second edition of the Great Soviet Encyclopedia tells us that the raid was carried out by order of the Minister of the Interior Johnson Hicks. But who gave the instructions to the minister? Hicks himself referred to Baldwin and Chamberlain, a friend of Deterding, by the way. But even English historians treat his testimony with caution. Americans Norman Palmer and Thomas Allen write in their Encyclopedia of Espionage that the police acted at the request of the British counterintelligence MI5, which allegedly established the espionage nature of Arcos' activities, and that after studying 250,000 confiscated documents, the British authorities announced the discovery of spy evidence. It was, presumably, nonsense. Arcos at that time became our widest trade window to Europe. Total turnover more than £55 million, of which approximately 2/3 were imports to the USSR. And if Arcos had been used by the Foreign Department of the OGPU as a setup, then for this alone not only the entire leadership of the INO, but also the entire KGB elite would have burned. But nothing like that happened. However, in England everyone suddenly stood on their hind legs. As a result, on May 27, 1927, diplomatic and, more importantly for many, trade relations with the USSR were severed. They were torn to the detriment of not only the USSR but also England itself. Soon the activities of Arcos were restored, and it existed until 1929. So from what and from whom should we, dear reader, need to dance in order to understand both the raid on Arcos and maybe the burning of the Reichstag? Perhaps acquaintance with one long-standing story will help us here. Much later than the raid on Arcos and much earlier than the burning of the Reichstag, an almost incredible event took place in London. The case of the Deterding company Astra Romana was heard. During the investigation, one of her bosses, MC Dogan, was asked a sensitive question. You received £4,000 a year. Meanwhile, you are by no means an oil specialist. Perhaps you can explain what exactly your service consisted of. MC Dogan just grinned. Sorry, but my functions are extremely difficult to determine. Ilya Ehrenberg certified this general specialist as the former head of British counterintelligence, but MC Dogan was only one of its high ranks in MI5. The chain here seemed to be quite definite. Deterring, Astra Romana, MC Dogan, MI5, MC Dogan, Minister Hicks, 150 policemen in the Arcos office, MI5, Minister Hicks, Prime Minister Baldwin and Chamberlain. But since even the High London Court failed to determine the functions of deterring MC Dogan's employee, then, as we see, even in encyclopedic publications everything begins or ends with dummy figures like Hicks. So, Sir Henry fought, not without success, against the Soviet danger on the English market front already at the end of the 1920s. Now, in 1933, Dettering's interests were threatened by the Soviet danger in yet another potentially largest market, German. Hitler's coming to power clearly programmed, at a minimum, a sharp increase in Germany's military power, because in 1933 the Germans generally did not have a serious army. Thielmann was not entirely right when he said that Hitler was war, but there was no doubt that Hitler was the largest military expenditure. Without strong armed forces, the elimination of the Versailles system turned out to be impossible, and the modern army is gasoline. After the First World War, Lord Curzon noted that the Allies sailed to victory on a wave of oil, and for future wars this phrase was even more true. This means that the Führer's Reich foresaw colossal purchases of oil and petroleum products. But purchases from whom? The West or Russia? The fight against Versailles is a fight with the West, not with Russia. Naturally, the West would not help Germany in this fight. The Soviet Union could, on the contrary, become a natural ally of Germany. Yes, he was always a consistent opponent of the anti-German ideas of Versailles. The problem of raw materials, and especially, in modern terms, the problem of energy resources, were acute for the Reich. The Egfarben industry concern was, however, moving towards the successful completion of work on producing synthetic gasoline from German coal. But the easiest way for the Reich to obtain natural oil and gasoline was from the Soviet Union in exchange for loans and expanded supplies of industrial equipment. Stocks of gold and currency were holding back our imports, and black gold would be an excellent substitute for the despicable metal. Objectively, the interests of the USSR and the Reich here coincided so much that the mere thought that because of this, brilliant prospects for profitable geschäfts could float away, oil hit Dettering in the head even more, than Yaren. Firstly, the Russians could, in a matter of years, not only correct their payment imbalance with Germany, but also have a positive balance here. In other words, by pursuing the correct German oil policy, the Soviets became incredibly stronger, and at the same time gained the opportunity to influence the Führer. Secondly, with this development of events, the Reich's economy became even more closely intertwined with the Russian economy, and their connection was already very strong. From an economic alliance to a political one, if not one step, then not 10. All this smelled of such a world fire that Trotsky's bold plans paled in comparison. Russia, in a strategic alliance with Germany, actually excluded the option of domination over the world by the Anglo-Saxons, whose natural leader was already America, whose natural leader, in turn, became that international capital of which Dettering was the flesh and blood. It was time to light the preemptive oil flares. Moreover, the Soviet-German oil union was already a reality. Mentioned in Kinchuk's telegram derep, the name can be deciphered as German-Russian kerosene. From petroleum, kerosene is precisely the Soviet-German joint stock company for trading petroleum products. There was also a mixed society Derianeft. It specialized in oil, and derep was engaged in the supply and sale of our gasoline and kerosene. These products have always been in short supply for Germany and, in any case, have never been superfluous there. There were, by the way, transport joint societies. Derutra, Derjeluft. For a long time, derep flourished, but now it was increasingly being persecuted in Germany, and the reports of Soviet correspondents agents, more precisely, correspondents Kate and Annenkova, were also poisoning these wounds. The matter seemed murky. Derep found itself in the position of a boycotted company, even with an official order from the Reich Ministry of Economics and Internal Affairs to facilitate purchases from it. What could be the cause of the interference here, if not the machinations of competitors? And which of the competitors acted more shamelessly and decisively than Deterding? Derep was an even more convenient target because one circumstance made this particular Soviet German society very vulnerable both to Deterding's provocations and to the justified claims of the Germans themselves. Derep gas stations covered the entire country. It was a whole coordinated all-German network, elements of which were located even in places where there was no trace of Soviet consulates. Therefore, Derep turned out to be an ideal tool to cover up the work of the Comintern and the German Communist Party. Both the first and the second really took full advantage of it, which gave rise to stormtrooper raids, searches, boycotts and newspaper articles. Deterding did not just glance at this, rubbing his hands. Naturally, he also contributed to the intensity of passions. Direct contacts of Deterding's agents with certain Nazi circles were, of course, not only not excluded, but were simply inevitable. So, at Derep, a variety of interests crossed, starting with the black political goal of creating a quarrel between the USSR and the Reich, continuing with the red needs of the Comintern and ending with the green appetites of Deterding. Later, Deterding achieved his goal in Germany, even in the part of Derep. Having become adept at organizing a raid on Arcos, his generalist specialists organized a series of raids on Derep branches in a number of German cities in 1933. And Derep burned down, although not physically, like the Reichstag, but figuratively. However, this happened a little later, when Deterding carried out considerable preparatory work in all necessary areas. Setting fire to Derep overnight, immediately after the Nazis came to power, was a difficult task even for Sir Henry. Therefore, it seems very likely that Deterding and the Deterdings decided, we'll have to confine ourselves to the Reichstag. I don't deny, dear reader, that this is just a version, but a version that was not expressed out of the blue. And the fact that, for all its attractiveness, at least as a version, it has very firmly found itself in the historical shadow, we should only alarm. By the way, there are many contradictory details that suggest that, in fact, the Deterdings managed here even without Göring, and only then Hitler and Göring simply seized on the opportunity that presented itself. General Halder, however, later said that Göring once boasted to him that he knew the Reichstag better than anyone, because he burned it down. But Göring, as chairman of the Reichstag, could know its building already by virtue of his position, and the Reichsmarshal liked to boast for the sake of a nice word, and even when he was drunk. Such revelations on this score from Rauschning, known to us, are even more dubious. And here you believe more in Göring himself, who later stated that he did not set fire to the Reichstag for the simple reason that there was no use in it. The lists for preventive arrests of communists had been ready for a long time, and what happened only alerted the Communist Party and somewhat interfered with the planned plan to neutralize the Telmanites. Well, it's not all that implausible, dear reader. If the burning of the Reichstag had really been planned by the Nazis as a staging of the beginning of a communist uprising, then they would have had enough strength and intelligence for a couple of additional provocations in Berlin. This is the detail. When Hitler, after the fire at 11 o'clock at night, appeared at the editorial office of the Volkischer Beobachter to inquire how they were going to cover the arson, he found only half-asleep typesetters, and only later the deputy editor-in-chief came. Then Hitler personally, together with Goebbels, sat down to prepare the materials. So, perhaps it was not so much to Hitler and Göring as to Deterding's greed and foresight that Georgy Dimitrov owed his great fame at the Leipzig arson trial that began in the fall. The involvement of one of the accused, the Dutchman Marinus van der Lubbe, was beyond doubt. It was he who was detained by the police in the burning building. But soon in Germany, the chairman of the executive committee of the Comintern, Dimitrov, who had arrived there illegally, was arrested, and his comrades, the Bulgarians Popov and Tanev, as well as the leader of the German Communist Party faction in the Reichstag, Torgeler, were added to him. An investigation began, and the trial in Leipzig was supposed to prove the inflammatory role of the Comintern and Thielmann's party. The left argued the opposite, cursing the Nazis. Storms raged in the press. Reading transcripts is not only a useful activity, but sometimes also exciting. The transcripts of the Leipzig trial against the Reichstag arsonist van der Lubbe and his accomplices, which began on September 21, 1933, are no exception. Dimitrov was given the opportunity to actively participate in the process and, being accused, he often behaved like a prosecutor or even like a political agitator. Therefore, the judges had reasons to cut him off or even deprive him of his speech. Dimitrov was not very interested in finding out who set fire to the Reichstag. He knew for sure that the communists had nothing to do with this. It was more important for him to show that the Nazis were pursuing a policy of widespread suppression of the communist movement within the country. But neither the Prussian Prime Minister Göring nor Goebbels, who were called to the trial as witnesses, did not hide this. Dimitrov's dialogues with Göring on November 4 and with Goebbels on November 8 were, of course, purely political. By the way, even school children knew about the dialogue between Dimitrov and Göring. But about the discussion between Goebbels and Dimitrov, I am not sure that any other historian knows. An experienced propagandist, Goebbels himself asked for such a discussion and looked, perhaps, more convincing than his opponent. Göring was getting excited, and it was not difficult for Dimitrov to get him angry. The accused posed questions to the witness in such a way that Göring said after one of them, "I sometimes heard that you are a big cunning person. So I assume that the question you asked has been clear to you for a long time." Dimitrov responded immediately, "Mr. Prime Minister Göring, if I could speak freely." But he spoke, it must be said, very freely, although formally he only had the right to ask questions directly related to the work of the trial. This is what it looked like. "Mr. Prime Minister and Minister of the Interior of Prussia, after you officially declared to Germany and the whole world that the arsonists of the Reichstag were communists." "Yes," Göring inserted proudly, and Dimitrov continued, "that the Communist Party did this." Göring put both hands on his hips and readily agreed, "Yes, that the German Communist Party contacted van der Lubbe, a foreign communist, and other similar entities. Did not this statement of yours direct the police and judicial investigation in a certain direction, and did it exclude the possibility of following other tracks in search of the true arsonists?" "I understand what you want to say," Göring began. "Everything is clear here. The law requires the police to conduct investigations in all directions. But I am not a criminal police official, but a responsible minister. It was important for me to establish not so much the identity of an individual petty criminal, but the party and worldview that are responsible for this. It was a political crime, and it became clear to me and is clear to this day that your party is a party of criminals." Dimitrov insisted, and Göring said irritably, "Mr. Dimitrov, I'll add the following. If there was any influence in this direction, it was directed in the right direction. This is your opinion, Mr. Prime Minister. I have a different opinion. But mine is decisive. I'm the defendant, of course." Here the chairman of the court, Binger, intervened. "You just have to ask questions." Dimitrov agreed. "I continue, Mr. Chairman. Does Mr. Prime Minister Göring know that this party with a criminal outlook, as he puts it, is ruling over a sixth of the globe, namely the Soviet Union?" Dimitrov here, as they say, was playing around. Firstly, Göring blamed the German Communist Party, but the ruling party on 1/6 of the planet was another party, the All-Union Communist Party, Bolsheviks. Secondly, Dimitrov here directly acted against the state interests of the USSR, unnecessarily dragging him into the matter. Well, thirdly, he achieved his goal, and Göring finally lost his temper and threw. Unfortunately, this remark will still bother him, because the Moscow and Western press, which wants to quarrel between Russians and Germans, have squeezed everything out of it, and Litvinov's kid did not leave her without attention. They say that with these two passionate words Göring grossly interfered in the internal affairs of the USSR. And this, dear reader, despite the fact that Dimitrov secretly came to the Reich not from Tibet but from Moscow, and Dimitrov developed the Soviet theme further, and that the Soviet Union maintains diplomatic, political and economic relations with Germany, that its economic orders have given and continue to provide work to hundreds of thousands of German workers. Is this known? There was laughter in the hall, and Göring frowned. I know that. Fine. The Bulgarian approved, and the German became even more puffed up and continued. I know that, but I would prefer it if I also knew that the so-called Russian bills have already been paid. This would contribute to the actual employment of the workers carrying out these orders. In fact, reader, we paid regularly. So Göring blurted it out without thinking either. However, it was Dimitrov himself who brought him to this blunder. Moreover, the head of the Comintern was only a major political figure in an international organization, and Göring was one of the highest official state leaders of a power that had normal diplomatic relations with the USSR. So Dimitrov's irresponsible provocation harmed Soviet-German relations here too. The Bulgarian, of course, outplayed the German in the discussion. But this play on the fiery nature of the former World War I drove a wedge between the two countries. Western newspapers immediately exaggerated this skirmish, and the Soviet embassy made a remark. But the Germans were not inclined to quarrel, and 2 days later, on November 7, Wolf's official press agency notified the Frankfurter Zeitung. Due to the incorrect transmission and tendentious interpretation by some, the foreign press reports the testimony of Mr. Minister-President Göring at the trial of the Reichstag fire. It is reported that until now the Soviet Union has always made its payments to Germany punctually. Let's return, however, to the courtroom where the started skirmish successfully continued. Göring became increasingly irritated but was still able not to deviate from logic. Having blundered in accusing the USSR of inaccurate payments, Dimitrov's attempts to unite the German Communist Party and the Soviet state into something single, he reasonably remarked, "We are talking about a foreign power here. I don't care what's going on in Russia. I deal only with the Communist Party in Germany." The court hearing looked less and less like one and more turned into a skirmish between two political enemies. And then Dimitrov set himself up. As a private citizen, he could say whatever he wanted, but as the leader of the Comintern, headquartered in Moscow, he simply had no right to say what he said to Göring. Of course, it is your right to fight against the German Communist Party. My right is to help ensure that the Communist Party fights the government and operates in Germany under illegal conditions, but how we fight is a matter of the balance of forces. That's not the point. It's good that Binger intervened and interrupted the overly frank head of the Comintern. "Dimitrov, I forbid you to conduct communist propaganda here." After all, Dimitrov was clearly giving all the enemies of the USSR a powerful trump card. "We declare at all corners that the USSR does not interfere in the internal affairs of foreign states." 6 months before Dimitrov's Leipzig statement, our plenipotentiary Kinchak assured Hitler personally of this. And suddenly an outstanding communist internationalist admits the opposite. He openly, of his own free will, admits that the hand of Moscow is not an invention of Goebbels but an everyday detail of the work of the Comintern. Yeah, well done. But Dimitrov had already taken the bit between his teeth, and in response to the chairman's remark heatedly objected. "Mr. Göring is conducting National Socialist propaganda here." Binger was also already boiling. "I categorically forbid you. There should be no communist propaganda here in this hall, and that's exactly what you are doing." Mr. Chairman Dimitrov continued. Mr. Prime Minister Göring explained that such a power abroad as the Soviet Union and the country associated with this power can do whatever it wants. But in Germany there is a struggle against the Communist Party. This worldview, this Bolshevik worldview, dominates the Soviet Union, the greatest and best country in the world. Is this known? And Göring became enraged. "I'll tell you what the German people know. The German people know that you are behaving shamelessly here. But I am not here to allow you to blame yourself. You are a witness," Dimitrov reminded corrosively. and in my eyes you are a swindler who should just be hanged. Very good, I'm pleased, Dimitrov grinned, and Binger immediately intervened. Dimitrov, if you say a word now, you will be expelled, so that you do not engage in communist propaganda. If you want to ask questions, then only relevant ones. Dimitrov smiled. I am very pleased with Mr. Goring's answer. It makes no difference to me whether you are happy or not. Binger became completely angry. Very satisfied. After these statements, I deprive you of your words. Dimitrov was serene. But I have questions. I deprive you of your words. Sit down. I have questions related to the case. I deprive you of your words. As sad as it is to admit, reader, the chairman of the Criminal Senate of the Imperial Court, Binger, was right. The accused at the trial can, of course, disrespect the court, but silently, to himself. But Dimitrov did not calm down here either. Ignoring Binger's prohibition, he mockingly addressed Goring. Are you afraid of my questions, Mr. Prime Minister? It's you who will be afraid as soon as you fall into my hands after the trial, you scoundrel. And immediately after this, Binger excluded Dimitrov from the meetings for 3 days. By the way, Soviet historians often quote Dimitrov's last remark as affirmative, although, as we see, it was, interrogative, which is far from the same thing. They also claim that Goring attacked the USSR, although, as we saw, he did not attack us, especially on his own initiative. And here's how historians Melnikov and Chnay describe van der Lubbe's behavior. For all 3 months, he answered all questions yes and no, and only twice, as if waking up, raised his head and muttered, others. This, reader, is simply a lie. The young Dutchman indeed behaved strangely and often answered confusedly, but van der Lubbe's answers to questions asked to him at just one meeting on November 23, mainly by Dimitrov himself, took up several pages of a verbatim report. But one way or another, the atmosphere at the trial was such that neither Dimitrov nor the organizers of the London public counter-trial, in support of Dimitrov and his comrades, could touch upon the topic of possible involvement in the arson of Deterding or others like him. Yes, many people both on the right and on the left wanted to inflate the political moment and not someone else's selfish one. You won't get the trial of the century from a small Deterding scam with major consequences. Obviously, this is why Deterding remained behind the scenes of written history. He, however, did not rush into the frame. The main thing is that the prospect of a broad oil union between Russia and the Reich was thwarted. Soviet exports of oil and petroleum products to Germany decreased from year to year, although their consumption in the Reich increased from year to year. In 1938, the Germans imported about 41 million barrels of oil through Standard Oil of New Jersey, Shell, and the Anglo-Iranian Company. In all of them, Deterding had his own interests. Germany then produced 4 million barrels of natural oil plus 36 million from synthetic fuel. 41 million barrels is approximately 6 million tons. All of Iran was then producing 10 million tons. Mexico, less than 6. Romania, just over 6. The USSR produced about 30 million tons. That is, at least half of German oil imports could be our share. We could share 10% of the loot with the Führer for mutual benefit. Yes, the result of the Leipzig trial could not have been the triumph of the acquitted Dimitrov, but something more modest, but also more useful for the USSR, the exposure of attempts to oust the Soviet Union from the German domestic market. However, this required not only a different line of behavior at the trial of Dimitrov himself, but also a completely different foreign policy of the USSR. We could successfully counteract the oil machinations of the Deterdings only if our main task was to expose and disrupt plans to make the Reich and the Union mortal enemies. After all, Kinchek, in a telegram where Deterding and Derip were mentioned, gave, perhaps without realizing it, the key to such deposits of political and economic opportunities that all the Klondikes, Golcondas and mines of King Solomon, in comparison with them, would look like the provincial stocking of an old hoarder. The average German was more loyal to Russia, no matter what it was called, than to England and France. Even if Deterding's role was only a version, it was precisely this that was beneficial and smart to support Soviet foreign policy and to orient Dimitrov in this direction, since he was caught by the German police. And if Dimitrov's head had not been filled with ideas of world revolution, even though he did not support Trotsky, then the trial could have focused on the anti-Soviet machinations of the enemies of cooperation between the USSR and the Reich, and not on the anti-communist machinations of the Nazis. But who needed such a key to the situation? Dimitrov, as they say, wrong calico, small. Litvinov, but this also meant, instead of throwing an extra punch at Hitler, posing a direct challenge to England and even to international capital, including the USA. Litvinov was just setting off overseas to establish diplomatic relations with the States. Maybe journalist Kite and her colleagues needed this, at least as a sensation. But what then to do with the revelations of the damned fascist Middle Ages? As for Deroper, it increasingly became just a convenient excuse for aggravating relations. This was also facilitated by constant misunderstandings with the writings of ladies from Izvestia, TASS and their colleagues of the stronger sex. The so-called journalistic incident between the governments of the USSR and Germany before the start of the Leipzig process became especially loud. By that time, through the combined efforts of the Litvinov and Comintern armies, the first interstate cracks had already appeared, and when charged the affairs of the USSR, Besenov informed the State Secretary of the German Foreign Ministry, Außenamt von below, that we wanted to send TASS representative Bispalov and Izvestia journalist K to Leipzig. This request was rejected with Hitler's sanction. On September 20, our embassy already knew about this because it sent a note of protest to Außenamt. However, the energetic Madame Kite did not care about the prohibitions, and she and Bispalov left for Leipzig without permission. On September 22 at 7 o'clock in the morning, they were arrested at the hotel, and, after the intervention of the embassy, they were released on the same day. Of course, this was discrimination, but the hostility of the Germans did not arise out of nowhere. Kite's articles were hostile. Fortunately, Germany in 1933 provided many opportunities for this. Kite sowed a storm and received a storm. Could Litvinov and the fighters against fascism have missed the moment? On September 26, after Litvinov's insistence, a government resolution was already adopted to recall all our journalists from Germany and expel German ones from the USSR within 3 days. It ended up that on November 4, Kite and the TASS representative received correspondent tickets for the trial and again left for Leipzig. Naturally, we left with a feeling of victory and a desire to pay back more painfully. The Leipzig trial, with its passionate speeches by Dimitrov and the journalistic campaign in the Soviet press, immediately set the tone for the relationship between Nazism, which had become the state doctrine of Germany since 1933, and socialism, the state doctrine of the USSR. And the tone was extremely politicized, hostile, irreconcilable. Who benefited from it? Well, first of all, to all the haters of the USSR in Germany, in Europe and in the world. But he also suited the German Communist Party, because he provided it with support from the USSR. The Comintern and international, that is, Trotskyist Zinovieviite anti-Stalinist forces within the country also considered this course to be correct, because, in their opinion, this was how the European Revolution was approaching. If we take into account that the national composition of these anti-Stalinist forces was predominantly Jewish, then the anti-Germanism of Soviet foreign policy in an anti-Nazi package was especially desirable for them. The discord between Germany and the Soviet Union was disadvantageous for the German and Soviet peoples. What about Hitler and Stalin? Hitler, as a politician, relied on two forces: the broad masses and capital. The masses did not want hostility simply because the people themselves never want war. But German capital was by no means monolithically hostile to the Soviet system. Therefore, objectively, a USSR hostile to him was partly unprofitable and undesirable for Hitler. Partly because the duality of the political base, the duality and inconsistency of the Führer's worldview, the sobriety of the statist and the blindness of the anti-Bolshevik also determined the duality of the policy. Stalin's policy relied exclusively on the people, and therefore enmity with Germany was absolutely unprofitable for Stalin. However, to raise his voice in defense of state interest at the expense of ideology for Stalin in that situation would have been tantamount to political suicide, and it came out to say, is it necessary to make such a fuss about provocations that could further quarrel between the USSR and Germany? There was no one yet, although the interests of the USSR as a state and not a stronghold of the world revolution would be ensured precisely in this case. I will cite a little known fact but indicative. On January 4, 1934, a meeting was held at the Reich Ministry of the Interior. The number of participants was limited. The delicate issue of Dimitrov's expulsion was being resolved. The conversations were, accordingly, businesslike, frank, not in public, not in front of the press. The assumed representative saw no obstacles to deportation. The representative of the Prussian Prime Minister Göring, imperial advisor and one of the leaders of the Gestapo, doubted, since it was tempting for Göring to isolate the major functionary Dimitrov rather than deport him to the USSR. Let me remind you, Diels did not speak for the press and therefore his statements were sincere. There was no one to play around with and there was no need to show off in front of anyone. So this is what Diels said: Mr. Prime Minister and the entire imperial government would act inconsistently if, in the case of Dimitrov, they abandoned the principle that they have repeatedly publicly stated, their real desire to maintain friendly relations with Russia. However, they strongly oppose the communist worldview, not taking into account the fact that this worldview comes from Russia. So, dear reader, the Nazis were really ready to separate the cutlets from the flies. While fighting the communists inside and outside the Reich, they were not inclined to make the powerful state, Russia, their enemy. This is what was important to us above all, and this is what the Litvinovs ignored. Half a year before the start of the Leipzig trial, on April 8, 1933, Maxim Maximovich Litvinov received the German ambassador von Dirksen, who told him, Mr. People's Commissar, we have investigated all incidents with your citizens and the unhindered work of Soviet economic organizations in Germany will be ensured. And as for DEREP, investigations have shown that 85% of its German employees are active communists. So what Litvinov objected indifferently. However, the German government hopes that henceforth the employees of your economic bodies will not get involved in politics. At the same time, I am authorized to announce that Germany is ready to ratify the Berlin Treaty in the near future. Now to our ears, reader, this news does not mean anything special. But then it sounded about as unexpected as if Dirksen had announced Thielmann's inclusion in the imperial government. After all, what was the Berlin Treaty between the USSR and Germany? Its brief history is as follows. In October 1925, an international conference opened in the Swiss resort of Locarno. I already talked about it in the third chapter, but now I'll just remind and add something. Germany was being prepared in Locarno to join the League of Nations, and as usual, the written and true goals differed diametrically opposite. The main document of the Locarno agreements was officially considered the Rhine Guarantee Pact, which confirmed the Versailles borders in Europe. This pact, the Rhine Demilitarized Zone, would be worth talking about separately, and I hope that you and I, dear reader, will have such a conversation again in due time. In addition to peaceful official goals, the organizers of the Locarno Conference also had something else in mind. This is what was offered to the Germans. First, Germany must be ready to directly participate in the intense war with the USSR. Secondly, Germany, in the event of such a war, allows the troops of Western powers to pass through its territory. And third, Germany is participating in economic sanctions against the USSR. In other words, it is breaking off those trade and economic relations that it needed like air and which were expanding every year. Chancellor of Weimar Germany Stresemann was an anti-communist, but he was not a fool. Not only that, this simple combination of the intent, the USA did not formally participate but was implied, put an end to the policy of the Treaty of Rapallo with the USSR. They wanted to make an anti-Soviet shock ram from Germany, which always gets the most. Plus, this idea of the intent turned out to be economically lethal for Germany. Even Stresemann became stubborn. In Moscow, they were even more concerned and tensely awaited Berlin's reaction. Chicherin was the People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, and we are already familiar with his views on Soviet-German relations. The Germans understood everything perfectly well, and even before the end of the Locarno Conference on October 12, 1926, a Soviet-German economic treaty was signed in Berlin, and on April 24, 1926, the Berlin Treaty of Non-Aggression and Neutrality. On June 24, 1931, the Moscow Protocol extended the 1926 treaty. But all the democratic chancellors before Hitler, Bjarning, von Papen, von Schleicher, delayed its ratification. Reich Chancellor Hitler began his reign with strong anti-communist speeches and actions towards the communists of Germany. The USSR also got it in speeches. True, von Rath persuaded Litvinov to take this calmly, vaguely promising some important initiatives of Hitler. And now the totalitarian Nazi Hitler, through the mouth of Dirksen, notified Moscow that he was ready to abandon the stupid anti-Soviet political course of his democratic predecessors in favor of friendship and cooperation. After his message about the upcoming ratification, Dirksen stood almost at attention in front of Litvinov. He was joyful and solemnly silent, confident that he was participating in a historical event. Still would, after all, he brought the head of Soviet foreign policy the most important news for the USSR, perhaps the most important of all. It meant that Hitler was really ready to distinguish between communism and the Soviet Union, that while remaining an anti-communist, he did not intend to be anti-Soviet. In fact, this was the first and immediately largest sign that eliminating the future threat of war between the USSR and Germany was, oddly enough, even more real under Hitler than before, under the Weimars. And how, reader, did Litvinov react to such news? Maybe, in joyful excitement, he began to be interested in deadlines and details. Or maybe he expressed satisfaction. Or, however, you don't have to guess. History is silent about nothing here, since Litvinov deigned to record this conversation, unlike the conversation with Harriet. Having heard about the readiness for ratification, Litvinov could not completely control himself. The news was indeed both unexpected and unpleasant for him. It turned out that in his Slavic policy this damn Hitler began to act not at all in the spirit of his own Mein Kampf. Well, for now I had to come to terms with it, but that didn't mean I had to feign joy. And without removing the irritation from his face, Litvinov said in response, "So all the German government can do is advise the Soviet government to ensure that foreign employees of our economic bodies do not get involved in politics." Dirksen even leaned forward, as if not understanding Litvinov. The words of the Soviet People's Commissar were so inconsistent with what the ambassador expected to hear, and Litvinov had already fully acquired his usual aplomb. "I expected something different, Mr. Ambassador. I expected, first of all, an expression of regret about everything that happened. I don't know the exact percentage of German communists in Europe, but I still don't see why this circumstance could give rise to searches on Europe's premises." Litvinov fell silent for a moment and then finished, clearly mockingly. If employees were involved in politics, then they did it as private citizens. However, literally a month ago you not only arrested but even convicted English citizens from metropolitan vicars. You also arrested and deported our citizens. Dirksen spoke the truth, and the arrest, investigation and trial of the English specialists who worked with us caused a lot of noise both in the USSR and in England. Moreover, not all those arrested turned out to be guilty. But Litvinov rejected such parallels. "This is our internal matter. So I say the same thing," objected the discouraged Dirksen. "In just 3 months that have passed since the National Socialists came to power in Germany, so much mutual rubble has accumulated that, before the prospect of dismantling them, everything else could fade into the background." Dirksen did not believe his ears and mind. Is this really possible? On March 23, from the rostrum of the Reichstag, the Führer extended the hand of reconciliation to the USSR for the first time. His speech in Germany was regarded as a sharp turnaround. The Russians reacted belatedly and reluctantly. And before that, they themselves demanded a USSR-friendly speech from the Reich Chancellor. And even now, not after the speeches but after the largest German initiative, the problem can be reduced to a few arrests. But Mr. Litvinov Dirksen looked more and more confused against his will. You must understand that a new order has been created in Germany, and you should adapt to it in the same way as the new Germany is gradually adapting to you. Litvinov was impenetrably dry and arrogant. We are not going to adapt to provocations against our citizens and our organizations. Excuse me, Mr. People's Commissar, but how can you evaluate the behavior of your press? She deliberately ignores any positive steps we take. Izvestia after the speech of the Reich Chancellor called him hypocritical. But behind this speech is the continuation of real supplies of goods in both directions. What about the treatment of Ishlansky? Ishlansky, a doctor from the Deropa representative office, was also arrested shortly before but was quickly released. This is a sad incident and we have already expressed our regret. However, don't you think, Mr. People's Commissar, that you approach different countries with different standards? God forbid anyone interfere in your affairs. Dirksen hesitated, then continued. But regarding metropolitan vicars, you yourself recently told the British ambassador OVS that isolated cases of infringement of private citizens should not be allowed to influence political and economic relations. Is not it right? But in relation to Germany you act differently. I cannot agree with you, Mr. Ambassador. What about Izvestia? Whatever Izvestia and Pravda have written in recent days, they are an example of correctness and decency compared to the current German press. Dirksen was silent and stood thoughtful, with an absent look. It seemed that his thoughts were taking him into the future, and he was growing gloomy before his eyes. And Litvinov finished with the same hostility. In short, I declare to you an official protest about the atrocities committed in Germany against Soviet citizens. Comrade Gershelman, hand the text of the note to Mr. Ambassador. Dirksen took his leave, and already at the door he was once again burned with regret. And not a word about ratification. Ratification of the Berlin Treaty could be the hopeful comma that could easily be followed by continued dialogue. But from the very beginning, Litvinov drowned the potential of the upcoming ratification in deliberate petty quibbles. In turn, activists of the Trotskyist world fire also diligently poured sand into the axle boxes of the Soviet German composition. Yes, proletarian internationalism in the Kirsanov-Auerbach version overshadowed everything, just as, incidentally, a unique non-proletarian internationalism overshadowed everything. In the Anglo-French press, Litvinov and his diplomats did not notice the constant cobblestones thrown at the specific USSR, but the Germans were not forgiven for swearing even about nameless communism. And when there was a glimpse for the better, the Führer was immediately teased by all sorts of kites. With Derep, as with the general situation, it was getting worse. All over Germany it was heard, Russian gasoline is a breeding ground for propaganda. Yes, that's exactly what happened. But Litvinov was more concerned about attacks on Derep employees Rivkina, Kogan, Ishlansky, and not about the fate of Derep itself. Soviet Jews filled the office premises of the doomed joint stock company as if specifically to give rise to pogroms among the stormtroopers. The scandal was convenient, and there weren't enough German goaders, there were always our own at hand. This, reader, is how it looked in person. A new, already firmly Nazi Reichstag was elected on March 5th, but his usual residence was now in ruins, and so he took up residence in the garrison church in Potsdam. On March 21, the Staatsakt Act was to take place in Potsdam with an extensive program. A service, Hindenburg's speech, Hitler's government declaration, a RHVoice parade, a parade of stormtroopers and the SS, a concert, processions, demonstrations and celebrations. Soviet correspondents Kate from Izvestia and Annenkova from TASS did not receive invitations. Pravda correspondent Hartmann did not apply for an invitation. The day before, Kinchak's deputy Alexandrovsky came to complain to the head of the department of the German Foreign Ministry, Mayer. Alexandrovsky immediately took the bull by the horns. We protest against discrimination against representatives of the Soviet press who were excluded from participation in the Potsdam celebrations. Other foreign correspondents received the necessary invitations. Meyer returned from Geneva on the third day and was not in the know, but Kate and Annenkova immediately remembered. So these are the ones who write only bad things about Germany and don't see anything good about us. And they have been doing this not since yesterday, but for a very long time. Mr. Meyer, these are representatives of a government agency and an official telegraph agency. Well, I'll try to contact the press department and do something, but what else? It's up to you, but these lovely ladies will highlight the Staatsakt Act in such a way that they will only harm Soviet-German relations. And then we'll figure it out ourselves. Okay, I'll call you and let your press attaché come to the press department later. Permission was given, and the furious kite could now legally write another article about trampling democracy and a bunch of butchers. And ahead, as you know, reader, Leipzig adventures still awaited her. 3 weeks have passed since the conversation between Litvinov and Dirksen. On April 28, Lev Kinchuk entered Hitler's office. Von Ruth stopped at the door of the Reich Chancellor's office, letting the plenipotentiary through, and entering after him, led him to the owner standing at the table. My Führer, let me introduce you not only to a good ambassador of a good country, but also to an ambassador who speaks good German. Ruth began, smiling. Hitler extended his hand and said, I am all the more glad to see you, Mr. Ambassador, since my first 100 days have not yet expired. As you can see, having barely dealt with internal problems, we immediately began to take our relations with Russia onto the broad road. Hitler was kind, smiled and responded quickly and accurately. Kinchuk involuntarily watched him and noted to himself that the Reich Chancellor clearly knew how to control himself and at the same time had a pronounced individuality. Yes, Mr. Reich Chancellor, the government of the USSR was pleased with your speech on March 23 in the Reichstag. However, my government's faith in the future of our relationship has often been severely tested in recent times. Harsh. What do you understand, Mr. Ambassador, by this harsh word? Disrespect for our citizens, illegal searches. Perhaps, an irritated and at the same time tired intonation appeared in Hitler's voice. You see, a revolution took place in Germany, and although it was not bloody, as in any revolution, it cannot be avoided without excesses. It's unlikely that your country has already forgotten about this, right? Hitler fell silent, gathering his thoughts, waved his hand, removing his bangs, which immediately fell back onto his forehead, as if brushing away something still invisible. He raised his hand again, this time in warning, and began, Mr. Kinchuk. He pronounced the difficult surname separately, but carefully. We really just getting on our feet. However, now we stand firmly and steadily. The time for change passes and the time for work comes. This must be stated as a fact. Both our states must recognize the unshakable facts of mutual existence for a long time and proceed from this in their actions. Our countries are each their own rightful masters, and good housewives do not interfere in each other's inner lives. Hitler stopped for a moment and Kinchuk immediately interjected. Such non-interference has always been our guiding principle and has been strictly implemented. Hitler looked searchingly at Kinchuk, then at Ruth, then back at Kinchuk. He touched his nose, looked at Kinchuk again, this time longer, and continued. The power of National Socialism has been established once and for all. Our internal enemies turned out to be extremely weak. To be honest, I greatly overestimated the strength of both the Social Democrats and Thlman. The party mass of the Communists was not bad, and the Social Democrats. Hitler interrupted himself, laughed and said defiantly, if I had been at the head of their parties, then things could have looked completely different. For the average person, communism has a lot of attractive things. But regardless of the difference in worldviews, we are connected by mutual interests, and this connection is long-lasting. And I mean both the economic and political areas. We have the same difficulties and enemies. You must take care of your western border, we about the eastern. Let me remind you, dear reader, that to the west of Russia there was lordly Poland, and she was to the east of Germany. Kinchak moved his eyebrows, either agreeing or not, but Hitler did not seem to notice this and continued. Germany has a difficult economic situation, but it is also difficult for the Soviets. I think we should always remember that both countries can complement each other and provide mutual services. Our era is difficult, Mr. Ambassador. What would the fall of the National Socialist government mean for Germany? A disaster. And what about the fall of Soviet power for Russia? Same. In this case, both states would not be able to maintain their independence. And what would come of it? Kinchak was carried away by listening, without noticing it. Hitler was completely different from the polished von Papen and the slippery von Schleicher. He was simple, natural, and most importantly, there was thought behind his words, not protocol. And Hitler, pleased with the attention of this Bolshevik, repeated his own question. Yes, what would come of this? And he himself answered, this would lead to nothing other than sending a new Tsar from Paris to Russia. And Germany in such a case would have perished as a state. The Führer paused and then finished in a business-like tone. As for specific questions, have you dealt with them? Yes, my Führer. And speaking frankly, I consider Mr. Kinchak's claims to be fair. Figure it out. Of course, we need to sort all this out. What else? I don't know who to contact with this, Mr. Reich. Chancellor Kinchak threw up his hands. We have already drawn the attention of the German government many times to the disastrous nature of its measures for our exports. We buy a lot, especially from you. This means they have to pay a lot, and the main means of payment for us is export. Hitler turned to the minister. We need to get serious about this. Sit down and talk about what to do next. Then he looked at Kinchak again. I will instruct Hagenberg to contact you and look for ways to reconcile our interests. It was a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Kinchak. If any difficulties arise, you can always contact me personally. The best mediator is a firm handshake, and I will be at your service. Reader, I did not invent these Hitler monologues. They almost exactly repeat the official record of this conversation with Kinchak. And in this speech Hitler was undoubtedly sincere. Less than 3 months had passed since the establishment of his chancellorship. After gaining personal power in the wake of destabilization, the Führer was in dire need of stabilization, both internal and external. Moreover, formally, Hindenburg still had supreme power. There was still more than a year left before his death on August 2, 1934. Only after it did Hitler proclaim himself the leader of the German state, and the armed forces took the oath of allegiance to him. Hitler's position was not yet absolute, although he had already become the only conceivable factor in the stabilization of Germany. He had to strengthen his position quickly, and in such a way as not to tilt the country either to the left or too far to the right. Although he came to power during the process of Germany's shift to the right, and his political struggle was financed by anti-communist capital, often hostile to the USSR. And so, in his first conversation with the plenipotentiary representative of the land of socialism, Hitler thought and spoke not as a salon politician of rotten parliamentary culture, not as a convinced anti-communist, covering up hatred with politeness, but as the leader of his country, aware of its interest in what it really is. In fact, there were many opponents of the course of rapprochement with the USSR, and not of enmity with it, both inside Germany, in all layers of the elite, and outside it. They had more than enough power and opportunities. Provocations in such a situation became not only possible, they were inevitable. But Hitler was looking for ways not to provocation as the main instrument of relations with us, but to such a solid base on which he could calmly go about his business, each of his own. A few years earlier, the reputable French Tan wrote, "The Republic finally needs its own anti-communist policy. State authorities must go to the end in implementing the principles they so often proclaim and aim their blows at the head and heart of communism. Maintaining diplomatic relations with Moscow and at the same time acting in France against communism is like solving a circle. And Hitler, it seems, was ready to solve this quadrature in German conditions. If Litvinov had wanted, he would have understood himself and explained to Stalin and Molotov that the case of Germany and Hitler was fundamentally different from other European bourgeois democracies. Germany was looking for something between divisive capitalism and collectivist socialism. Among the career parliamentary leaders of Europe, Hitler was a foreign body not only because of his origin, but also in his entire nature, political and human. Friend of the USSR Eduard Herriot thought not about the USSR but about France and assigned the USSR only the role of a plug in the holes in French politics, and at the same time he was a purebred bourgeois in all respects, and Hitler was a social reformer, inconsistent and unstable every now and then, but a reformer. And by this alone he could be closer to us than to bourgeois Europe. All these Baldwins, Stresemans, Bennys, KTS and Harriets were afraid of personal responsibility like the devil of incense. They weren't even afraid, they were simply incapable of it. Hitler openly pursued the personal power of the leader, cementing the efforts of the nation with himself. Even then, the myth was born that Hitler was exclusively a product of Versailles, that he rose to the occasion on the feelings of humiliation of the Germans and on the thirst for revenge. Such a view cannot be called nonsense, but it was not Versailles that was the main issue. Hitler was brought to power by the Germans' hope for a better society. It was precisely people from the foreign policy sphere of life in Soviet society who could understand all this due to their official position. To understand and transcend ideology the way Hitler was ready to do was the direct official and civic duty of Litvinov and his employees. Exactly. Moreover, it was they who came into direct contact with the German leadership. Stalin did not go to Berlin. Litvinov went there. More precisely, as a rule, he stopped on his way from Paris and back. And how did Litvinov and the Litvinovites fulfill this duty? But this is petty and stupid. Yes, they simply neglected him. And they acted directly contrary to him. There were, say, quarrels over the fact that the Reich post office delayed thick parcels with dozens of copies of Pravda and Izvestia addressed to the embassy. The Germans in Moscow received their press in diplomatic packages, but the Berlin embassy rejected the same option. And in the name of what? To cause more friction for the sake of friction. To transfer a couple of extra dozen Izvestia newspapers to the German Communist Party through Derep. However, on May 5, Dirksen and Litvinov exchanged instruments of ratification in Moscow on the entry into force of the Moscow Protocol of June 24, 1931. The Volkischer Beobachter responded to this with a huge editorial in 2 issues. Goebbels wrote, "By this act the German national government demonstrated that it intends to maintain and develop in a friendly spirit political and economic relations with the Soviet government." Izvestia, the brainchild of Steklov Nakamks, which Bukharin was about to begin editing, the latter would be replaced by Tallinn 1936, reacted differently. The Germans would have found nothing but skepticism and grumbling there. Friendly relations provoke a friendly response, hostile actions provoke a corresponding rebuff, ended the Izvestia editorial of May 6. Well, it was not for nothing that Semyonov Landers put into the mouth of his starlets the idea that the last word is remembered. However, the situation was not lost then. On May 10, 5 German generals arrived in Moscow, led by the chief of armaments of the Reichswehr, von Bockelberg. The Germans were introduced to the Central Aerodynamic Institute, TSAG, the test site in Luga, and factories in Golodwin, Leningrad, Kharkov, Zaporizhzhia, and Moscow. Formally, Tukhachevsky invited them in response to his 1932 trip to German military enterprises. But of course, the trip and the essence of the contacts were sanctioned by Stalin in Moscow and Hitler in Berlin. This time Stalin received information about the visit from first and reliable hands, from Voroshilov. On May 13, at a reception with Dirksen, the dapper Klim spoke of his desire to continue to maintain ties between friendly armies. The mood was high, the atmosphere was quite sincere. Dirksen was beaming and especially cordial. But fun is fun, and an embassy reception is not fun, but work. And the word here is not a sparrow, because every serious word is immediately caught and recorded by both sides. But what about reports on table conversations are then studied very carefully. and they also carefully weigh what they say. So, not after an extra glass. This is not Paris, you can't relax, Tukhachevsky told the Germans. Do not forget that we are divided by our politics and not by our feelings, the feelings of friendship of the Red Army for the Reichswehr. And always think about this. You and we, Germany and the USSR, can dictate our terms to the world if we are together. If what was said ran counter to Stalin's opinion, then it simply would not have been said out loud, publicly. But no, Tukhachevsky was now acting in an official capacity and worked here for Stalin because he said things that were necessary and beneficial to the USSR. The piquancy was that such a line by Tukhachevsky was unofficially beneficial to himself. Von Seeckt was dying in Germany. Like the French Harriet and Herbert, he was a patriot, but a patriot of Germany. And therefore, when thinking about Germany, I could not help but think about France and Russia. In his book Germany Between West and East, Seeckt wrote, France, bearer of the destinies of Germany. Seeckt considered Russia to be the key to a confident German destiny, but he understood, Russia fears that Germany will one day betray its friendly relations with the East in exchange for a gift in the West. On the day of Siekt's funeral, Field Marshal Blomberg gave Hitler the text of the deceased's will, where he implored Hitler not to be prejudiced towards Russian issues and to come to an agreement with the Soviet Union. Soon, the VE Department of the Main Directorate of State Security of the NKVD put the statement of this will on Vroshilov's desk. A very interesting and almost true document. Smart Germans, even fascists, cannot reason differently. KB Klim Vroshilov wrote in the corner of the document, yes, a lot depended on a lot, but for now the general foreign policy of the Union still depended on how Litvinov handled the matter. And there, as luck would have it, however, for many in Moscow it's the other way around. Just in time, in June a scandal with the Hagenberg Memorandum arrived at the International Economic Conference in London, which began on June 12. The story of this memorandum reached its logical conclusion in the August conversation, remember, reader, between Dirksen and Molotov, but it made a lot of noise in June. And it did even more harm. Alfred Hagenberg, then already nearly 70, had a bright temperament. He lived to be almost 90 years old, but his career as a politician ended in the same summer of 1933. Hagenberg was not just a convinced pan-Germanist, it was he who founded the Pan-German League. Until he was 50, he successfully headed the board of directors of Krupp, and then, in 1916, he started his own business and soon became one of the most powerful industrialists in Germany. In addition, many newspapers, telegraph agencies and publishing houses were in his hands. The largest film studio UFA was also his property. Hagenberg blocked with Hitler, quarreled with Hitler, but helped him a lot in the early 30s. In the first cabinet of the new Reich Chancellor, Hagenberg received the post of Minister of Economy, and on June 17, 1933, he presented his confused and emotional memorandum to the London Conference. They talked about the colonies lost by the Reich, the need for new lands for the energetic German race and much more. Russia was not remembered with the best words either. The London Daily Herald, hostile to both Germany and the Soviet Union, immediately began to pull out phrases from the memorandum and interpret them at random, but with one general meaning. That's great, the Germans will go to war against the Soviets tomorrow behind the living space. Space in Germany was indeed tight. There were 145 people per square kilometer. We have 8, and even in the European part, 23. And chapter 14 of Hitler's famous early work Mein Kampf talked specifically about Lebensraum, that is, about this very living space in the East. But as for Hagenberg's speeches, there was a gag from the film and newspaper magnate. Moreover, Hagenberg did not have to borrow ideas about the Lebensraum from anyone. On the contrary, they borrowed from him. The Eastern lands were such a fad for the cheerful pan-Germanist that at the age of 30, in 1894, he tried to buy out Polish lands to resettle German settlers there. Brave old Fred never suffered from either a lack of decisiveness or a lack of subtlety. For Litvinov, Hagenberg's prank became a gift of fate. He could now poke his nose with this memorandum at all corners, starting with his beloved Izvestia, where his interview was hastily published, and ending with Politburo meetings. Then Molotov himself compared the newspaper fake with the original text and realized that the matter was not worth a damn. But that was later. And now Kinchak was urgently sent to warn Below. After listening to further protests, Below said tiredly and indifferently, "I'm going on vacation, so Nrit will still answer you officially. But I will say unofficially that the answer will be sharp. You are very sensitive and picky, gentlemen. The newspapermen got it wrong, but you are immediately happy to write notes. I myself contacted London and checked the authenticity of the text of the Daily Herald and that part of Hugenberg's speech that talks about the USSR. Speaking of new settlements, Hugenberg had in mind Canada, Chile and South America in general. Speaking of colonies, Africa. And he reproached you for your low purchasing power. And here, too, China suffered more than you. In addition to Hugenberg, there is also Alfred Rosenberg, who talks about expansion at the expense of the USSR. Kinchak did not give up. Rosenberg. Reasoning is his hobby. Rosenberg does not have government status. Let me be honest, Mr. Kinchak. What would you say if we started quoting to you the thoughts of the founder of the USSR, Lenin, about the world revolution? Or articles from the Comintern magazine? After all, if we proceeded in our practical policy from their literal analysis, then we should have long ago come to grips with Russia in mortal combat. And we buy rye from you and sell you Demig taps, Mannesmann pipes and Siemens turbines. Germany in relation to the USSR stands on the point of view of traditional friendly relations and will never take the same part in the Entente intervention against you that we some people are pushing. Kinchak was silent, and what could anyone object to? And Below ended conciliatorily. I spent the whole day yesterday looking for Hugenberg on the phone, but I couldn't find him. You know, he has completely failed with his national party and is busy working to liquidate it. Hugenberg was the leader of the far-right National Party, which often acted together with Hitler's NSDAP, but by the summer of 1933, a mass exit from Hugenberg's party began. And all that remained was to formalize this collapse legally, which is what Hugenberg was now doing. The eccentric politician suffered another fiasco. Hitler recalled him from London and immediately dismissed him. I sent it demonstratively, so that it would be clear to everyone. The reason was the memorandum, which caused irritation, albeit ill-founded, in Russia. Hitler clearly did not want the extension of the Berlin Treaty to hang in the air, and once again hinted that he was ready for a joint search for reliable ground for relations between the two countries. A week later, Kinchak was invited by Nrit. Dear Mr. Kinchak, I convey the answer to your protest. Thank you. I will hand it over to my government. Mr. Kinchak, I was surprised and annoyed when I saw Litvinov's interview in Izvestia. Why is this so, based on the Daily Herald's distortions? And Rosenberg. Rosenberg, don't you think that Hugenberg's resignation should convince you more of the friendliness of our intentions? I repeat, there is an obvious misunderstanding here, but your sharp reaction was the main reason for his departure. The Führer does not want to cloud our relations even with misunderstandings. He is upset that lately there have been no serious friendly efforts on the part of the USSR. On the contrary, the tone of the Soviet press is becoming increasingly harsh. Why do we need conflicts? Kinchak, without answering the question, stubbornly continued. We understood the memorandum correctly. There is a call for war with us. Well, here you are again. The Union of Germans Abroad is waving provocative letters about the famine of the Germans in the USSR, and the White Guards from Rand participated in the state demonstration on May 1. Dear Mr. Kinchak, you can't keep track of everything. These hunger letters are psychopaths, and we are closing Rand. Do I need to explain to you how many people benefit from quarreling us? And yet, you need to get rid of the shadow sides that affect the USSR. Kinchak, at Litvinov's invitation, conscientiously worked through the routine topic d'Europe in his conversation with Nrit. He did not forget about the next arrests. Well, in Paris and London, Soviet citizens were detained extremely rarely. But does this mean that France and England were more friendly to the USSR than the Reich? Yes, they also traded with us. but they received mostly raw materials from us and did not really share industrial equipment, and this proved the far from peaceful sentiments of the Anglo-French. It is easier to take raw materials from a colony, semi-colony or war, and Germany supplied us with industry, a product unsuitable for colonies. However, Litvinov insisted, Germany is aggressive. Let me remind you, reader, that we are talking about 1933. That year, Germany was still very weak and had practically no combat-ready army, prohibited by Versailles. Only a year later will the Luftwaffe construction program be approved with the expectation of reaching a modest figure of 4,000 aircraft by 1935. Serious training of combat pilots capable of flying these aircraft had just begun. Only in 2 years will universal conscription be introduced in Germany, and the strength of the newly formed Wehrmacht will still only be planned at the level of 500,000. There was no trace of mass production of tanks in Germany. The artillery is weak and old. In the fall of 1935 we conducted the famous Kiev maneuvers where 2,500 paratroopers fell on the heads of stunned military attaches and observers from Europe in 10 minutes, and Vroshalov chuckled at the same time. You, gentlemen, have not seen a landing force of 6,000. There were about 1 million people in the Red Army. Germany was so weak that when in the spring of 1936 Wehrmacht battalions entered the demilitarized Rhineland, France, if it wanted, could swat these troops like a fly. And Litvinov in his reports depicted Germany ready to conquer the USSR in almost a week. Yes, Hitler immediately brutally suppressed his internal political enemies, the communists, and at the same time the social democrats. But being a practical anti-communist in your own country does not mean being a practical anti-Soviet in relations with the USSR. Yes, Goring, in response to Dimitrov's statement that communists rule 1/6 of the globe, said in the heat of the moment, unfortunately. But we already know, reader, that before this Dimitrov provoked him by starting a conversation about the USSR on his own initiative. The Comintern press later wrote that Goring allegedly attacked the Soviet Union. But this was a deliberate lie. Goring, on the contrary, even infuriated by Dimitrov, said that he did not care about Russia. Even in poor self-control, he made it very clear that the leaders of the Reich were ready to make a distinction between the communists in Germany and the communist leadership of a great power. And if you take a closer look at the noise around Europa, in addition to the fact that he was a thorn in the side of the Deterrings in 1933, he did not leave the lips of Litvinov's army. But why only Derep? Why was he the only one subject to provocations, searches and boycotts? After all, there were also Deryaluft, the Russian-German Air Transport Society, Deryaneft, the Oil Trading Society, Derutra, the Warehousing and Transport Partnership, and for some reason there were no boycotts. Why? Probably because in these societies, which did not have an all-German network similar to Derep's gas stations, they did without combining responsibilities regarding the tasks of the Comintern. The annual report of the USSR Embassy in Germany for 1933, compiled by Kinchak's secretary Gershfeld in collaboration with Besenov, Vinogradov, Ioff, Troyanker, Isansen, Levitin, Gasyek, was in fact a major sabotage. They wrote it deftly. 1933 was a turning point in the development of Soviet-German relations. The coming of the Nazis to power in Germany put the implementation of the long-standing anti-Soviet plans of Hitler and Rosenberg on the order of the day in German foreign policy. The ultimate goal of these plans was to create an anti-Soviet bloc of Western European countries under the leadership of Germany for a campaign against the USSR. Yes, the picture turned out to be impressive, formidable and plausible. Obliged to France by Versailles, in fact dismembered by the Versailles Polish corridor, deprived of aviation, tanks and navy, Germany with a couple of dozen divisions of the 1933 model is leading a new crusade Europe to the USSR. What should a diplomat be concerned about? What is his duty to the country? Of course, first of all, to ensure peaceful and friendly relations with the host country. Secondly, to ensure a profitable relationship. A diplomat is called upon to reconcile and unite, and not to quarrel and separate peoples and states. But in Hirschfeld's report there was no room for reflection on what and why it was not possible to do in Germany to strengthen ties with it, to create an atmosphere of friendship or at least the absence of enmity. This was not in the report, but there was something else. The Soviet public and the Soviet government reacted with extreme caution and skepticism to Hitler's peace-loving assurances of March 23 and May 17, to the ratification of the Berlin Treaty and to Unruh's speech of September 16, 1933, considering these speeches and acts just a maneuver. And then the machinations of Nazi Germany were again described in the best possible way. Germany was not fascist but Nazi, but this inaccuracy merely showed the demonstrative inability and unwillingness of the embassy to understand the ideological intricacies of the new state order. And that wouldn't be so bad. What was worse was that Ludwig's comrades shifted the blame for the 2-year delays in ratifying the Berlin Treaty from the real culprits Bjarning, von Papen, von Schleicher and the Weimar regime to Hitler. That is, the one who, having come to power in January, having achieved victory in the elections in early March using anti-communist and anti-Soviet cards already at the end of March, actually disavowed his previous course, at the beginning of April declared his readiness for ratification, and at the beginning of May it already done. Nice maneuver. What did he give to the Führer at that time, besides the obvious dissatisfaction of the industrialists who supported him and, indeed, the weariness of the capitalist West with which he still had to play a difficult and multi-round game? Yes, in fact, the game has already begun. And the West immediately followed it with anti-Soviet cards in the hope that Hitler would immediately begin to accept them. At the same time, the West provoked us. Also on May 5, when Dirksen and Litvinov exchanged instruments of ratification, the English Daily Telegraph published an interview with Hitler where the Führer allegedly said that Germany would be entirely occupied with the search for living space in Eastern Europe. Litvinov's kid immediately seized on this distorted statement and slipped additional distorted translations to Molotov. And now it was not the democratic West itself, but Litvinov, for the sake of this West, who was poisoning the bile of the Soviet Prime Minister. Molotov, out of Russian habit, believed newspapers. He could not imagine that the British were capable of such brazen twitching. Moreover, the text was placed on his desk by his own foreign policy department, and behind Litvinov's indignation Molotov somehow did not have a simple, fairly obvious thought. Well, Hitler is not a total fool. You can, of course, play a double game, but only a madman can play it openly. It seems that the Führer cannot be denied political intelligence and dexterity. And then it turns out he made a mistake. The basis for such reasoning was, as they say, by ear. Judge for yourself, reader, what it looks like. On April 28, behave loyally with Kinchek. On May 5, officially confirm loyalty to the Soviet-German Treaty of 1926. And on the same day, if you believe the English newspaper, declare in secret to the whole world that Germany, they say, doesn't think about anything else except how to capture the USSR. Perhaps, for such an interview there was no need to go to Berlin, a trip to London Bedlam, where there were always enough different Napoleons in straitjackets would have been enough, and Hitler was a smart politician. Ever since the Civil War, the Genoa Conference and Locarno, the Entente had one desire in relation to Germany and the USSR, to play off each other. To vent in the expectation that the boot of a German soldier will crush the new life of Russia. For this purpose, conferences, meetings, deliberate information leaks and newspaper articles were launched. What the catch was, Hitler knew perfectly well and knew how to use it. Under an anti-Soviet smokescreen, he entered the Rhineland, armed, received loans and lulled the vigilance of the West. But there is no such thing as a stick without two ends. And with one end it has hit relations with Russia over and over again. Hurt. To be honest, not very much. During the entire turbulent, decisive turning point there are here, year of 1933, only 39 short-term arrests of Soviet citizens and 69 searches of their apartments were carried out in Germany, and sometimes arrests and searches were combined. And keeping in mind the Comintern connotation of Europe, we must admit that the searches were not always unfounded. For a year like the German 1933, the number of reasons for our discontent content in general was small, but Litvinov's People's Commissariat submitted as many as 217 written notes to the German Foreign Ministry alone, not counting countless oral statements. The epithet countless is not the fruit of my creativity. This expression is from the report of the plenipotentiary mission in Germany for 1933. Yes, with such talents it would be like Privos in Odessa. All the traders would run away, seeing how a molehill was made out of a molehill. Was it worth raising such a pan-European outcry over essentially trifles? Of course, journalist Kite suffered a lot of fear, but it was only useful for her. The description of the atrocities looked more natural, although in reality it only came to the point of rudeness. Of course, the rudeness of the Germans did not look good, but what could be the price of our utmost restraint? The price of our endurance. And here's what: stability of relations with Germany. Was this not enough? The enemies of Germany and Russia put isolated excesses on one side of the scale. What could be put on the other side of the scale? On the other side, as Ambassador Arbit wrote to Minister Harriet in 1925, Germany and Russia, both reborn, could be side by side. With the Daily Telegraph and Daily Herald, bribes are smooth. Well, they did not quite understand the idea of Mr. Reich Chancellor. They included old statements in the text of the interview, they quoted unsuccessfully, etc. As for the leaks of information about the plans of Hitler and Göring from French and English sources, which Litvinov also reported, such leaks were too profitable for these very sources to treat such information with special confidence. They cost even less than the distorted interviews. Another thing is a confidential official conversation between the de facto head of the German state and the Soviet ambassador. Did the direct words spoken by Hitler to Kinchak weigh less than the ducks of the London Daily? And even more so is the ratification by the Nazi authorities in the shortest possible time, in 2 months, of the agreement that the old Weimar authorities had pointedly neglected for 2 years. Yes, they tried to disavow Hitler in our eyes from all sides. However, was it really difficult to think? Why are the British, Harriet, and Ditterdings adding kerosene? Why is Lloyd George suddenly so friendly to the Bolsheviks in conversations with our London ambassador Msky? Even the American Hearst agent Wiegand assured Litvinov in Berlin on October 28, 1933, that Hitler was ready to fight the whole world, and the Soviets in particular. This, they say, was just told to him by Hitler in a confidential conversation, not for the press. But why did Wiegand suddenly open up to the #1 diplomat of those Bolsheviks whom his boss would be happy to grind into printing dust? From an unexpectedly awakened love for the USSR, neither Kate from Izvestia, nor Gershfeld, nor Litvinov's deputies, Krestinsky and Karakan, nor Litvinov himself wanted to take these obvious considerations into account. This is truly, by their deeds you will know them. Afterward, so, my dear reader, the year 1933 of real history was ending. My book is also ending. We leave Russia and Germany at the second great crossroads of their historical relations in turbulent modern times. Peace and cooperation, or war and mutual destruction, mutual weakening. For the first time, Russia and Germany, the Russian and German peoples, faced such a choice on the eve of the 20th century. Having everything to strengthen each other with a strategic alliance, the leaders of the Russian Empire and the German Reich were unable to overcome the streak of misunderstandings and far-reaching provocations of France, England, the United States and, in fact, international capital. And instead of an alliance that firmly programs the European world, these leaders led their countries to the mutual destruction of Russian and German power in the First World War. The end of this war found the two powers in a position of outcasts. Germany found itself defeated and crucified on the cross of the Versailles Peace. Russia found itself outside the law due to the fact that it had truly placed itself outside the laws of the world of capitalism. Treaty of Rapallo 1922 between Weimar Germany and the Russian Soviet Socialist Federative Republic, correctly RSFSR. Approx. Lenok 555 not only broke through the wall of alienation between us but also contributed to the destruction of the regime of political boycott and bullying of Russia and Germany by third countries. Germany needed Russia for one reason, Russia needed Germany for, yes, actually, for the same. The Germans needed to rev up their powerful but war-torn industry, and here Soviet Russia, with its plans for industrialization, was an almost ideal trading partner. It was no less important for Russia to gain the opportunity to make large purchases of machinery and industrial equipment which the outside world, except Germany, was stingy with for the proletarian republic. Russia needed access to advanced technical knowledge and technologies, and Germany found itself without highly qualified carriers of such knowledge, and they gladly went to Russia to work, and this meant that the Russians could learn from the Germans what they needed vital. The German Reichswehr was prohibited from having aviation, tank troops, or conducting serious research and experimental work in the field of weapons, and he received such an opportunity at the training grounds of the new Russia. It was here that German pilots and German tank crews studied, but at the same time, the Russians also perceived the experience of the brilliant German army. And we have always been famous not only for our quick adoption, but also for our ability to unrecognizably improve what we adopted. Russia opposed the Versailles dictatorship, and Germany, by the fact of official diplomatic relations with Russia, proved that the Bolsheviks were by no means devils with horns, and it was quite possible to deal with them. Finally, it was beneficial for both Germany and Russia that the newly created lordly Poland, the brainchild of Versailles, should feel squeezed between the Germans and the Russians. There were common points of contact of interests, and not even points, but in general the possibility of a common line on many issues. But this possible common line also had many enemies, both on one side and on the other. And you and I, dear reader, saw this. The end of the Weimar Republic was the beginning of the Third Reich, and the first year of this Reich, which counted on a 1,000-year history, could and did determine a lot. For the second time in a short historical period, the Germans and Russians had to decide, together or separately, where to go, towards friendship or hostility, towards discord or harmony, towards peace or towards a new war. The Nazi Aryan orchestras still played the Soviet "We Are Born to Make a Fairy Tale Come True," not paying attention to the fact that the words and music of Air March belonged to two smart Soviet Jews, Hermann and Haidt. And in this march there were, among other things, the following words: "We are aware of how the air fleet is growing stronger, our first proletarian fleet in the world." It was sung there like this. And believe us, the air fleet will be able to give an answer to any ultimatum. But what was already heard in Berlin, as in Moscow, was by no means only bravura music. Some people here and there would like to replace the cheerful marches with a funeral march. In this, the 33rd year of the 20th century, Hitler publicly declared the desirability of friendly relations with the Soviet Union and ratified the Berlin Treaty, which a number of Weimar chancellors had not done before him. And he also gave an unspoken instruction to postpone the payment of the USSR's debt on a long-term loan provided even before he came to power. However, on September 3, 1933, he made a statement that he renounced war as an instrument of politics, adding, "By waging war against Bolshevism, Germany is fulfilling a European mission." However, almost simultaneously, on October 14, Hitler officially announced that Germany was withdrawing from the Conference on Disarmament and the League of Nations and explained why. To be in such an organization where there is no equality for a country with a sense of honor with 65 million people population and a self-respecting government is an intolerable humiliation. Yes, Hitler faced a very difficult diplomatic game with the West, and he could not balance on the European political tightrope without having in his hands a balancer, at one end of which the thesis of the fight against Bolshevism within the Reich was strengthened, and at the other, the thesis of the fight against that Bolshevism, but outside the Reich. Anti-Soviet rhetoric was intended for the West, real friendly gestures, Soviet Russia. But it was not Maxim Maximovich Litvinov who was capable and inclined to assess the situation in exactly this way. In 1933, he went overseas to prepare the ground for the establishment of diplomatic relations between the USSR and the USA. There was nothing bad about that, of course. The bad thing was that at the same time he deliberately worsened and complicated diplomatic relations with Germany. On September 2, 1933, a treaty of friendship, non-aggression and neutrality was concluded between the USSR and Fascist Italy. So a precedent for serious official friendly relations with real Italian fascists was created. But Litvinov and the Litvinovites did not even want to think about moving towards something similar in relations with the German fascists with the Nazis. Although the peaceful prospect in relation to the Reich was not only more important for the USSR than in relation to Italy, but vitally more important from any point of view: economic, military, political, scientific, technical and even cultural. On November 12, 1933, in the elections to the Reichstag, 93% of voters voted for the NSDAP. It was the only one on the ballot, but on November 16, the USSR and the USA established diplomatic relations. In Leipzig at that time, the trial of the Reichstag arson was in full swing. And on the same November 16, Georgy Dimitrov addressed the criminal senate with a petition to interrogate Th-man as a witness. There Dimitrov wrote, "Is it true that at the beginning of 1933 and by the time of the Reichstag fire, all the activities of the KPD, in accordance with the decisions of the Communist International, were oriented towards the political mobilization of the masses, towards the establishment of a united front of struggle of the proletariat and towards the defense of the labor movement and its vanguard, but in no case into a direct armed struggle for power." That is, Dimitrov wanted to say that neither the Comintern nor the Th-man party thought about any forceful overthrow of capitalism in Germany. Well, maybe so. But on the same day, November 16, in the Czechoslovakian Týnek, 1,400 metal workers of the Bansko-Hutní Společnost factories adopted a protest resolution demanding the release of Dimitrov, Popov, Tanev, Th-man and Torgeler in the following terms: "We are convinced of the innocence of those arrested and firmly believe that the real arsonist is the bloody government of Hitler, which itself should be sitting in the dock." What was said here, dear reader? Well, firstly, even before the end of the trial the culprit was identified, somehow incorrect. Secondly, the government was called bloody, and the head of the neighboring sovereign state in which this government and its leader had just received almost 100% popular support was called a criminal. It's also somehow incorrect. Thirdly, the resolution ended like this: "We warn everyone who would like to condemn the innocent and declare that the working class is ready with its revolutionary militant offensive to overthrow the fascist monster not only in Germany but also in other fascist states and to establish the dictatorship of the proletariat as the only real means of liberating the proletariat from the hands of the executioner of the working class, fascism." That's it. The Czechs, unlike the Germans, did not show much revolutionary spirit in the era of the Russian October Revolution. And here even the Czechs were ready, it turns out, to overthrow the fascist monster with a military offensive right in Germany itself. And the Germans at that time, according to Dimitrov, did not think about any directly armed struggle for power. Yes, dear reader, all this did not really fit with Dimitrov's assertions that the KP was not a combat detachment of the Comintern, but almost an educational organization, that Th-man was not a militant leader of the proletariat focused on establishing Germany proletarian dictatorship, but only the organizer of the political mobilization of the masses. But the protest campaign of the proletarian masses was carried out in all countries under the leadership of the Comintern. It's strange, and besides, the threats of the Czech metal workers against the fascist states, of which, besides Nazi, to be precise, Germany, there was only one, Italy, also looked fanfare, and even that had just concluded a friendly treaty with the proletarian Soviet Russia. No, not everyone in Moscow, Berlin, Leipzig and Týnek wanted such a development of events in Europe, when lasting European peace would become the key to peaceful industrial development and strengthening of the only real socialist country. Some saw a European fire fanned by the Comintern against fascism and capitalism, others saw a crusade against the Soviets. But just like on the eve of the First World War, this new European clash was thought of by lovers of fires on both sides of the barricades as a confrontation between the USSR and the Third Reich. We leave these two states and their peoples at a crossroads. Together or separately, history then posed this question to the Germans and Russians for the second time. And the coming years were to bring new events, new circumstances and new decisions, which, my dear reader, as I already promised in the preface, I intend to talk about this in my new book about the 30s of the 20th century. So see you again. Sergei Kremlev, Sergei Brezhkan, January 12, 2003, 13 hours 50 minutes. Thank you for downloading the book from the free electronic library Royal Libru. http Royal Libru. Leave a review about the book. http Royal Libru. Comment Kremlev Sergius Россия I Germanium Stili Poroznь СССР Stalin I Reich Hitler HTML. All books by the author. http Royal Libru. Author Kremlev Sergius HTML.